age, and speaking my mind even when it made adults uncomfortable. For that, my mother said I was too much. Too loud, too stubborn, too unfeminine. She would glance at me with a mixture of irritation and disappointment, as if I were a puzzle she had no interest in solving. I can still remember the sting of those words. At family gatherings, when relatives filled our living room for Thanksgiving or Christmas, the spotlight always found Sophia. "Doesn't she look beautiful in that dress? Sophia is such a sweet girl. You must be so proud." My mother would glow with pride, soaking in the praise, nodding, smiling. And where was I? Standing at the edge of the room, invisible. If I tried to share something like the ribbon I won at a spelling bee or a story I wrote for school, it barely registered. My father might nod distractedly. My mother might wave me off with a tired smile, but the conversation always swerved back to Sophia. It was as though I did not exist unless they needed to make a point about how Sophia outshone me. The cruelest cut came when I was a teenager. I had worked for months on my grades every night, buried in textbooks, fueled by the belief that hard work could open a door no one could close. When the letter arrived offering me a scholarship, I felt for once that my parents might look at me with pride. I held the letter with trembling hands, my heart soaring with hope. That night, though, my mother pulled me aside, her tone soft, but her words sharp. "Emma, we need that money for something important. Your sister has prom coming up, and she deserves a dress that will make her shine. You'll get other chances, but Sophia only has one prom." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if my opportunity was nothing more than a resource for Sophia's spotlight. I watched as my scholarship money vanished into satin and sequins, as Sophia twirled in front of the mirror while my mother clasped her hands and whispered, "Perfect." That was the pattern of my childhood. My efforts were invisible. My sacrifices erased my worth, measured only by what I could provide for someone else. I learned early that in my family my value was conditional. If I stayed quiet, if I bent, if I surrendered what was mine, then I could avoid conflict. But if I tried to stand tall, if I claimed something as my own, I was punished. I became skilled at hiding my feelings, at swallowing the hurt, at telling myself that one day I would escape this house of mirrors, where Sophia's reflection was the only one that mattered. Looking back, I understand why the slap at my sister's wedding cut so deep. It was not just about that moment. It was the culmination of years of being told I was lesser, of being robbed of opportunities, of being made to feel like a shadow in my own life. Every insult, every dismissal, every time I was told Sophia was the daughter they had always wanted, it all burned inside me, waiting. Even as a child, I knew there would come a day when I would no longer be invisible, when they would see what they had thrown away. That night, when my mother used my scholarship for Sophia's dress, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched. I was 15 years old, but I felt decades older in that moment. My tears had dried, leaving only resolve. I whispered a promise into the darkness, a promise I would carry with me for years. One day I told myself they will regret this. One day they will see that the daughter they dismissed was stronger than they ever imagined. One day they will realize that they cannot erase me. I swore one day they would regret treating me like I was invisible. Leaving my hometown was not just a change of scenery, it was an escape. After years of being treated as second best, I carried with me a burning determination to build a life where my worth could not be measured by anyone else's approval. San Francisco seemed like another world compared to the small town where I grew up. The city was fast, unforgiving, and dazzling all at once, and I arrived with nothing but a suitcase, a scholarship that I had fought to replace after my mother stole the first one, and a belief that hard work would be my way out. University was nothing like I imagined. The lectures were overwhelming, the competition fierce, and the cost of living suffocating. To make it through, I worked part-time jobs, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, anything that could keep me afloat. I was a waitress balancing trays heavier than I was a cashier at a convenience store that never slept, and a tutor for high school students who could never guess how close I was to collapsing myself. My days often started before sunrise and ended long after midnight. There were weeks when I survived on instant noodles and coffee, my body trembling from exhaustion. More than once, I sat on the floor of my tiny rented room, my head in my hands, whispering to myself that maybe I should give up. Maybe going back home was easier. But the memory of my mother's dismissive words and my sister's shining smile always kept me from surrendering. I would rather collapse in this city than return as the invisible daughter they remembered. The loneliness was crushing. San Francisco was full of people, but in those early years I had no one. I walked the crowded streets feeling like a ghost, unnoticed, unimportant, but stubbornly moving forward. My professors challenged me sometimes harshly, and my classmates seemed born into advantages I couldn't dream of. They had family support money for books, even cars to drive to class. I had blistered feet from walking miles to save on bus fare. But each hardship carved something into me, something harder than stone. I began to understand that resilience was not a gift, it was forged in fire. It was during one of those endless nights when I sat hunched over an old laptop in my cramped room that a different kind of spark lit inside me. The laptop was secondhand, the keys worn smooth, the screen flickering if I tilted it wrong. But it was all I had, and it became my companion. I was studying, yes, but I was also observing the world around me. I saw women like me, ambitious, intelligent, determined, who were constantly dismissed, overlooked, or underpaid. I remembered every insult every time my mother said I wasn't feminine enough, every time relatives dismissed my achievements, and I realized it wasn't just me. It was a pattern, a system, a wound society inflicted on countless women. That night I began to sketch an idea. What if there was a platform that gave women resources, tools, and connections to build their own businesses? What if women didn't have to ask for permission, didn't have to wait for validation, but could seize opportunity on their own terms? The thought thrilled me. It felt audacious, almost impossible, but also inevitable. I started writing coding with what little I knew, researching late into the night. I wasn't sure what it would become, but I knew it was something more than homework. It was a seed, fragile but alive, planted in the soil of my exhaustion and anger. There were nights when I doubted myself. I questioned whether I was smart enough, skilled enough, strong enough. My bank account often had less than $50, and my body ached from endless shifts. But the more I worked on that idea, the more it fueled me. It gave meaning to the struggle. Each sacrifice, each sleepless night felt less like suffering and more like an investment. For the first time, I had something that was mine alone. Not my sister's, not my parents', not anyone else's, just mine. Looking back now, it seems almost impossible that a flickering old laptop in a tiny room could change the course of my life. At the time, it was nothing but scribbles of code and messy notes. But that fragile idea carried something powerful: defiance. It was my answer to every moment I had been overlooked, every time I had been told to step aside so Sophia could shine. I was no longer willing to be invisible. I was building something they could not steal. I didn't know it then, but that small, fragile seed of ambition would grow roots deeper than I imagined. It would push through concrete, break through barriers, and one day stand taller than anything my family thought they controlled. I had planted it in silence, watered it with sleepless nights and stubbornness, and all the while it was growing. I didn't know that seed would grow into an empire they could never control. In those early years, as my idea took its first fragile shape, I learned quickly that ambition alone was not enough to open doors in Silicon Valley. I had my notes, my wireframes, a shaky prototype on that battered laptop, and a vision I believed in with every ounce of my being. But belief does not pay for server space, and vision alone does not convince investors who look for polished numbers and famous last names. I walked into pitch meetings wearing a second-hand blazer, my hands sweating as I clicked through slides. One after another, they turned me down. Some were polite, their smiles thin and dismissive as they told me to come back when you have traction. Others were blunt, cutting me down with words that still sting. Your market is too narrow. You don't have the background. You don't have the right team. What they meant was clearer than what they said. You don't belong here. Each rejection carved a deeper scar. I would leave those glass-walled offices with the city spread out beneath me, feeling smaller than ever. Nights ended with me staring at spreadsheets that refused to balance my bank account, gasping for air, wondering if my dream would collapse before it even began. Friends from my classes secured seed funding or internships at shiny firms, while I scraped together hours tutoring to pay rent. There were moments I questioned everything. Maybe my family was right. Maybe I was too ambitious, too stubborn, chasing something that would never materialize. And then I met David Morgan. He was not like the others, where the typical Silicon Valley investor was young, sharp-suited, and eager to chase the next trend. David was seasoned with silver hair, a quiet gravity, and eyes that seemed to measure more than just the numbers on a slide. I first saw him at a small networking event, hardly more than a dozen entrepreneurs crowded into a dimly lit co-working space. I had almost skipped it, worn down by another day of rejection, but something pushed me to go. When I stood to give my 3-minute pitch, my voice shook, but my words carried something raw, something born of every humiliation I had endured. Afterward, while others nodded politely and turned back to their drinks, David walked over. "Tell me more," he said simply. I sat with him at a corner table, expecting him to wave me off after 5 minutes. Instead, he listened. Really listened. I spoke of my vision, my belief that women needed a platform built for them, a place to access funding, mentorship, and tools without being belittled. He asked sharp questions, not to dismiss me, but to test the strength of my answers. By the end of the night, he handed me his card and told me to call his office the next morning. When I did, he surprised me again. He offered to fund my startup not with scraps or half measures, but with a check large enough to finally breathe. I remember staring at the zeros, unable to speak. He said something I will never forget. "I don't just invest in companies. I invest in people who refuse to be broken. You remind me of someone I once knew." Over the weeks that followed, I learned more about David. His reputation stretched back decades. He had built and sold companies, mentored leaders who now ran firms worth billions. But beneath his polished resume lay something darker. One afternoon over coffee, he told me a story. Years ago, he had been betrayed in a deal that nearly cost him everything. The man who betrayed him was none other than my father. My heart clenched as he spoke. He did not go into all the details, but the bitterness was clear in his voice, even softened by time. "Your father thought he was clever," David said quietly. "He underestimated how long consequences last." I asked why, knowing that history, he would choose to help me. He leaned back, considering his words. "Because you are not your father. I see in you the opposite of him. Where he took you, build. Where he manipulated you, endure. And maybe," he added, his eyes narrowing, "helping you is also a way to close a chapter that has been open too long." There was no pity in his tone, only respect laced with an old wound. He never treated me as a charity case or a pawn. To him, I was both a young entrepreneur with potential and a reminder that legacies are not fixed. Our conversations stretched late into evenings. He became more than an investor. He was a mentor, a steady hand when I felt like drowning. He reminded me that strength was not in never falling, but in rising again and again. Still, his warning stayed with me most of all. One evening, after a long day of reviewing contracts, he set down his pen and looked directly at me. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that pressed into me. "Emma, your family will come for you one day. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but they will. And when they do, they will not come with kindness. They will come with demands, with guilt, with pressure. Promise me something. If they ever corner you, if they ever try to take from you again, call me." I nodded, not fully grasping the gravity of his words, but his expression etched itself into my memory. There was something in his eyes, not fear but certainty, as though he had already glimpsed the future. I carried that promise with me, tucked away like an emergency key. I didn't know how soon I would need it or how high the stakes would rise. "If they corner you, call me." His words haunted me for years. David's backing bought me time, not immunity. Startups don't fail for one single reason. They fail for 1,000 small shortages arriving at once. Ours arrived like a slow tide, a key prospect delayed a decision, a marketing test underperformed, a vendor demanded prepayment, a new compliance fee kicked in. I stared down cash flow forecasts that were more wish than math, trying to stretch dollars into weeks, the way a hungry cook thins a soup. I learned to negotiate everything: rent licenses, even delivery fees, because every saved cent meant another day of life for the company. My team never saw me panic, but they saw me grind. They saw me carry a backpack full of cables and flyers across town because couriers cost money. They saw me bring in bagels on Fridays even when I was calculating whether the coffee budget should be cut. And late at night, when they were home with their families, I would sit in the dim quiet of our shared office and ask the question every founder asks in the dark: how much more do I have left to give? The answer looked grim. The morning a payroll reminder popped up and the balance didn't. I refreshed the bank portal until my eyes burned. The numbers didn't change. I called our largest prospect and made my last and best case for moving the pilot forward 2 weeks early. They couldn't. I called a friend who ran a small fund. He couldn't bridge on a weekend. I even drafted a message to David and then closed the window he hadn't invested in a bottomless well, and pride is a stubborn companion. Instead, I did what I always did. I put on a clean shirt, stood up straighter, and went to work. That afternoon, while hunting for pennies in the cushions of our accounting, I opened a set of filings I hadn't seen before. They were attached to a routine bank message, bland subject line, nothing to suggest a bomb inside. But the attachments told a different story: a loan using my company's legal name as collateral with a promissory note I had never signed dating back 6 weeks. At first, I assumed clerical error. Names get crossed, forms get duplicated. I checked the entity ID. It was ours. I checked the signature. The loops and angles were close to mine, but off too heavy in the tail, too hurried at the end. My stomach dropped. I'd seen that hand all my life on permission slips and lease agreements and birthday checks that always came with advice. It was my father's handwriting trying to be mine, and not quite getting there. I read the terms twice, then a third time, to be sure I understood the stakes. It wasn't an astronomical sum by Wall Street standards, but it was enough to break our knees if called enough to smash our credibility with the bank, enough to make future capital costlier than we could afford. A single late notice on the wrong line could strangle a young company. There were references to related entities I didn't recognize, and a mailing address that had nothing to do with our office. I printed everything, laid it across my desk, and felt something old and familiar rise like bile. How easy it had always been in that house to convert what was mine into what served them. Anger is clarifying. It burned off the fog. I called the bank and climbed the polite ladder: customer service supervisor specialist. I listened to phrases like documented authorization and established relationship. I asked for copies of everything, and then I asked how it had been authorized. The woman on the phone paused in a way that said the answer was both simple and unacceptable. "We have a completed consent with a matching signature," she said. "If you believe there's fraud, you'll need to submit a notarized affidavit." I thanked her, hung up, and stared at my reflection in the black glass of the office window. Fraud. The word fit too well. I didn't call my father. There was nothing I could imagine him saying that would undo what he'd done, and nothing I could say that would make him understand the difference between rescue and theft. He had never learned the difference. He had only learned how to dress one as the other. I did, however, call our attorney, and began the slow, precise work of documenting the violation. There's a kind of calm that takes over when you are out of options. You move, you check boxes, you prepare to take the hit and keep breathing. And then, like a trapdoor opening beneath my fear, everything changed with a single notice. Late the next day, the bank emailed a confirmation. The loan tied to our company had been satisfied in full. No renegotiation, no restructure satisfied. A wire had come in from an entity I didn't recognize, transferred against the balance, and the lien was released. The email was a page and a half of compliance language, but the sentence that mattered was 8 words long. Your obligation is now cleared in full." Relief hit me first so hard I had to sit down. A second later came suspicion, cold and surgical. People don't vanish liabilities of that size for strangers. I called the bank back and asked the only question that mattered: who sent the funds? They couldn't say, of course. Privacy protocols, third-party confidentiality. The legalese you hear when the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: shield the hands behind the money. The best I could pry free was the name of a shell, Westward Eclipse Holdings LLC. No address I knew, no individual attached. A corporate mask that could cover any face. I asked David if he had intervened. He held my gaze for the long moment, then shook his head. "Not me," he said. "If it had been, you would know." I believed him. He would not hide behind a Delaware envelope. He would sign his name. I asked our lawyer what it meant. He said it meant we were safe for now and more vulnerable than before. Whoever paid it had proven they had reach into our books and into our lives. They had placed themselves in our story without an invitation. I didn't tell the team about the forged note or the anonymous savior. I told them we were tightening spend, accelerating sales, and that the road would be steep. They nodded, grateful to have a road at all. I learned to live with the unsteady feeling that we weren't walking alone, that a footstep I could not hear had matched our pace. I checked our corporate credit monitor weekly. I put a freeze on new banking permissions. I started keeping hard copies of everything because paper resists the edits that are too easily made in the ether. The hard part wasn't the mystery. It was the implication. An act like that isn't benevolent. It's strategic. Someone with money and motive had decided it served their interests for my company to remain standing. Maybe they wanted influence later. Maybe they wanted leverage now. Maybe they wanted me to owe them a thank you I could never deliver. In business, debts aren't always denominated in dollars. Sometimes they're denominated in silence. On a gray Tuesday evening after the last engineer left and the cleaning crew rattled their cart down the hallway, I sat alone with the lights off and the documents spread like a map of a country I didn't want to visit. The forged consent, the banknote, the release. My father's heavy loops trying to mimic my hand. The shell company's name printed in black, neat as a threat. I thought of the girl I had been, the one who learned that her chance at a scholarship could disappear into a dress for someone else. I thought of the woman I had become who would not be erased so easily. And still, a fact remained: someone had reached into my life and moved a weight only I was supposed to lift. I locked the papers in the cabinet and went home. I slept in patches that night and woke with a headache. In the morning, I poured coffee, answered emails, and scheduled 3 new pitches. Work is a balm when the unknown gnaws at you. It was enough to get me through day by grinding day. But a part of me knew the truth that has a way of finding us no matter how busy we keep our hands. I didn't know who had stepped in. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't know when the favor would be called or what form it would take. I only knew this much: people who move in the dark don't stay there forever. I didn't yet know the figure behind that darkness was waiting to step out. When I look back on those years, the memory that always rises first isn't the exhaustion or the fear, but the moment the ink dried on my first international contract. I had fought for months chasing meetings across time zones, stumbling through boardrooms where men twice my age looked at me as if I were a reckless girl playing business. But I won them over not with charm or lineage, but with results. The contract was signed, and overnight the valuation of my company shot to $50 million. $50 million. A number so large I couldn't even say it out loud at first without feeling like I was talking about someone else's dream. I remember sitting in my apartment in San Francisco that night, staring at the city lights and realizing the impossible had happened. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. My 25% stake was no longer a fragile piece of paper. It was real wealth independence that no one could snatch away with a dismissive comment or a cutting glance across the dinner table. That equity meant I would never again be at the mercy of anyone, not even my parents. For the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. With that success came changes. I upgraded to a penthouse overlooking the bay, not out of vanity, but because I wanted a place that reminded me of what I had built with my own hands. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete, a sanctuary far removed from the cramped bedroom where I once wept after 16-hour shifts. Every morning I woke to the rising sun painting the city gold, and I reminded myself that I had earned this view. It wasn't given. It wasn't borrowed. It was mine. But success isn't just champagne and contracts. It is also whispers. It was during a quarterly review, surrounded by my team, when I overheard the first trace of unease. A colleague leaned too close to another and muttered something about a silent partner. I froze. Silent partner. I had reviewed the ownership documents countless times. I knew every line of my cap table by heart. 25% mine, a portion allocated to employees, the rest split among early investors. There was no room for ghosts. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just careless chatter. But the words stuck needling at me when I tried to sleep, echoing when I signed new deals. A silent partner meant someone was moving in the shadows, someone who might have a claim over what I thought was safe. And shadows had a way of reaching into my life before. I remembered the debt my father had pulled under my name without my knowledge, the mysterious investor who had swept in to clear it. Could the two be connected? One evening I cornered the colleague who had whispered about it. I asked casually, pretending curiosity more than suspicion. He shifted uncomfortably and shrugged. "Just something I heard from the finance team," he said. "You know how these things go. Sometimes companies have arrangements." His vagueness unsettled me more than a direct accusation would have. Arrangements. That word felt like a dagger cloaked in silk. I started to dig. Quietly, of course, because in the world of business, questions can reveal weakness. I combed through filings, spoke with contacts I trusted, even pulled old agreements from the early days of the company. Everything looked clean, yet the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, always just out of reach, like smoke slipping through my fingers. Still, I pushed forward. I couldn't afford to freeze in paranoia. Deals were waiting, teams depended on me, and the company's future required my steady hand. But in the back of my mind, unease gnawed. My 25% was more than just wealth. It was proof that I had carved out a space in this world on my own terms. If someone was lurking behind the curtain, watching, waiting, what did that mean for me? One night, David called to congratulate me on the expansion. His voice was warm, proud, yet tinged with something else. "You're standing taller now," he said, "but remember, high towers attract storms." I laughed politely, though unease churned beneath the surface. Did he know about the whispers? Did he suspect what I was only beginning to fear? I told myself I would get answers soon enough. Secrets have a way of surfacing when the stage is brightest. For now, I focused on what I could see and touch. Contracts signed, employees, thriving, the hum of a company alive with purpose. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, no longer the invisible girl. I was a woman with power, with equity that spoke louder than any insult ever hurled across a family table. But in the stillness of night, when the city lights flickered like watchful eyes, I felt it again. The prickling sense that I was not alone in my empire, that someone else had a hand on the scales. I didn't yet know who they were or what they wanted. But I knew this, my 25% was not just a stake in a company. It was tinder. And all it would take was one spark to set everything ablaze. That 25% would ignite a firestorm at the wedding. The rumors about a silent partner still clung to me like fog the morning the envelope arrived. My assistant set it on my desk with a look I couldn't read, and I knew before I touched it that it was from my family. Thick cream stock gold bevel on the edges, a faint scent of some expensive paper I'd never buy for myself. I held it a second longer than necessary, as if the weight might tell me something the words could not, then slid it open with the letter opener I kept for contracts far less personal. Sophia Hayes and Brian Whitmore, it announced in gold script that flashed when I tilted the card. The Grand Imperial Hotel, New York City. Saturday, 6 o'clock. I didn't need to Google the venue. I knew its reputation. Gilded ballrooms, chandeliers like frozen constellations, and marble that reflected more than faces. My parents would love it. The pageantry, the provenance, the way status hums in a room like that. They would tell everyone they had secured the site because nothing but the best would do for Sophia. They wouldn't mention the favors cashed in or the strain behind my father's smile. Beneath the invitation was a small photograph that slid into my palm like a memory I hadn't asked for. 2 girls on the sun-bleached steps of a porch. I was 8. Crooked smile hair escaping its braid, a book clamped under my arm. Sophia was 5, tilted toward me in a pink dress, her ribbon lopsided, her hand on my knee. On the back, in my sister's looping script, a note: "No matter what, we're still sisters." I sat down. I turned the photo over and back again as if the paper might warm and give up the truth. The words were simple. The timing made them complicated. If you have ever received tenderness from someone who once watched you bleed, you know the sensation how kindness can feel like a test you are destined to fail. No matter what, we're still sisters. Was it an olive branch? A manipulation? A calculated line meant to soften me for something else I had learned not to take anything at face value in my family. The price tag was always printed in a smaller font. I propped the invitation against my monitor and tried to work. The contract drafts blurred. My calendar reminders nudged and nagged. But in the quiet between emails, the photograph tugged. I remembered the porch heat, the cicadas, the way Sophia would lean into me when she was tired. I also remembered the day my scholarship money vanished into a dress for her prom, the way my mother said it was for the family's image, and how Sophia twirled while I held my breath. Forgiveness is not the same as amnesia. The body remembers in layers. I poured coffee and stood by the window that looked over the bay, a view that had become my private liturgy. When I first moved into this penthouse, I promised myself I would only bring in what was earned and what brought me peace. Family didn't fit the first rule, and rarely the second. Still, weddings are different kinds of summons. You can refuse a holiday, you can skip a birthday dinner, but a wedding is more than a party. It is a public declaration, a ledger of who stands with whom. Absence at a wedding is an answer of its own. I played the arguments out to their ends. If I didn't go, there would be a narrative waiting for me. Emma thinks she's too important now. Emma can't handle seeing her sister happy. Emma is still the difficult one. If I went, I would face the looks, the whispers, the soft barbs disguised as jokes. I would step back into a theater where the roles had been assigned when I was a child. Sophia, the princess. Emma, the problem. But I am not a child anymore, I told myself. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a woman who built something they cannot take. I could walk into that room on my own terms. That thought steadied me. I called my assistant and asked her to clear the weekend around the date. I booked a flight to New York that would land me with enough time to check in, dress without rush, and square my shoulders. Then I called the hotel and reserved my own suite. No favors, no family block, nothing that required my mother's name to unlock. Autonomy. I have learned lives in the details. That night, I showed the invitation to no one. I cooked myself something simple, turned my phone face down, and let the city's lights beat along the glass like a prayer I was still learning to say. Memories rose and bumped against each other. The porch, the scholarship, the forged documents I had found, the anonymous wire that had cleared a debt. I didn't owe a whisper at the office bar about a phantom partner. It was all connected, perhaps, or perhaps I was seeing shapes where there were none. Either way, the sensation remained, the feeling that some current under the surface had turned and I was being pulled toward a place I would have to stand. In the days that followed, I tried to treat the wedding like any other out-of-town engagement logistics, to manage a wardrobe, to select an itinerary, to tighten so there was no dead time for doubt to breed. I chose a dress that fit like armor and moved like water. Not flashy, not demure. Exactly me. I arranged a car, confirmed the hotel's security protocols, and asked my assistant to filter any calls from numbers I didn't recognize. It might sound paranoid, but vigilance is cheaper than repair. The photograph stayed on my desk. I reached for it sometimes without meaning to. That small tilted smile I wore as a child, the one that said I was trying hard to be good. I do not want that girl running my life anymore, I told myself. I want the woman I am now to make this decision. Go because you choose it, not because you're cornered by obligation or nostalgia. Show up standing straight. Leave if they cross the line. On the flight to New York, I let my mind go quiet. Clouds took the color out of the world, and the engine's low hum was an anesthesia against old noise. I slept in snatches and dreamed not of Sophia's Isle, but of contracts and bank notices of signatures that looked like mine and were not. When I woke, my jaw ached from clenching and my palms hurt where my nails had pressed. The Grand Imperial rose out of the city like a thesis written in stone. Bellmen moved like choreography. The lobby glowed. On the elevator ride up, other guests chatted in the language of people who have always belonged to rooms like these. I stood by the mirrored wall and looked at my reflection for a long second. Not to adjust anything, just to note who had walked in here under her own name. In my suite, I laid the dress out and set the invitation on the dresser. I turned the photograph over to read the words once more. No matter what, we're still sisters. I wanted to believe people could grow, that damage could be named and then repaired. But growth has a way of being loud when it's convenient and quiet when it requires cost. I decided not to forecast. I would let the night declare itself. When I finally zipped the dress and slid into my heels, the city was making that early evening shimmer that always feels like a held breath. I took mine, gathered my clutch, and walked to the elevator without theatrics. In the mirrored panel beside the buttons, my face looked calm. That felt like victory enough. I told myself I was walking into a celebration. I told myself I could leave whenever I chose. I told myself that history didn't have to repeat if I refused my assigned part. I told myself many true things. What I did not tell myself, what I did not yet know, was how thoroughly the script had already been written for me before I arrived, and how little the night cared for my quiet terms. I had no idea the celebration would become a public trial. The morning after I arrived in New York, I called David and asked if he had time to meet me. He didn't hesitate. "There's a little cafe on Lexington I like," he said, his voice steady and familiar. "Meet me there in an hour." By the time I slipped into the small brick-front shop, the city was already awake with its usual chaos. But inside the cafe was a pocket of quiet. David was already seated, his gray hair catching the light from the window, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. Not the perfunctory smile of an investor, but something warmer, something like recognition. I sat down across from him, wrapping my hands around my cup, as if the heat might steady the tremor I hadn't realized was there. He studied me for a moment, then said softly, "You don't look like a woman coming to a wedding. You look like a soldier about to step into battle." That broke me open in a way I hadn't expected. I told him everything I had been holding back: the photograph, the note, the endless rehearsals in my head of what might happen. I admitted I wasn't sure whether Sophia's gesture was an olive branch or a lure. I confessed the exhaustion of always second-guessing my family, the part of me that still wanted to believe reconciliation was possible. My voice caught when I said I was tired of being seen as the enemy, even by people who should have known me best. David listened without interrupting his gaze, steady, his fingers tapping lightly on the side of his cup. When I finally trailed off, he leaned forward. "Emma, you need to hear this. Hope is not a crime, but hope can't be your strategy. These people have taken from you before. They'll do it again if you let them. You have built something that no one, not even your family, has the right to touch. Keep your boundaries firm. Don't let them turn this wedding into another excuse to bleed you dry." The firmness of his tone both comforted and unsettled me. I had come looking for reassurance, and in some ways I got it. But I also got a warning I could not easily dismiss. He reminded me of something he had once said when I first launched my company: "Contracts protect money, but only you can protect yourself." Now, hearing him say it again, I understood he wasn't just speaking as an investor or mentor. He was speaking as someone who had lived through betrayal, someone who had seen what unchecked trust can cost. Still, I couldn't silence the softer part of me that clung to possibility. What if she really means it this time? I asked quietly. What if she wants to mend things? David's eyes softened, but his words were sharp. If she wants reconciliation, it won't come with strings. Real peace never does. If they ask for something, money shares anything that is not reconciliation. That's leverage. Remember that difference. I sat back, my chest tight with both gratitude and fear. He was right, and yet I couldn't let go of the hope that maybe in that glittering ballroom some bridge could be built. I knew how naive it sounded, but when you've lived a life starved of acknowledgement, even crumbs of affection can look like feasts. We talked for another hour, drifting from business to small memories until I felt steadier. When I rose to leave, David touched my arm and said quietly, "Emma, I mean this. If they ever try to corner you, call me. I don't care what time it is. Promise me." I nodded, the weight of his words pressing into me more than I wanted to admit. Walking back through the cold streets of Manhattan, I turned his advice over in my mind. Boundaries. Lines no one should cross. I had fought too hard, given too much to surrender what I had earned. And yet beneath the resolve, another voice whispered, what if this was my last chance to reclaim some version of family? What if my absence in their lives had been punishment enough? What if forgiveness could rewrite the story I carried, both truths with me, the steel of David's warning and the fragile thread of my own longing? I knew they couldn't coexist forever. One would have to break. As I dressed for the wedding that evening, slipping into a gown chosen to shield as much as to shine, I felt the tension coiled tight in my chest. I remembered David's steady gaze, the firmness of his voice, the weight of his hand on my arm. His warning would not leave me, no matter how much I tried to quiet it with hope. His words echoed in my mind as I walked into the lion's den. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be lighthearted, a celebration before the big day. But for me, it felt like walking onto a stage where every spotlight was angled my way. I had rehearsed polite smiles in the mirror, convinced myself I could endure one evening without incident. The hotel ballroom in New York was dressed in crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, the kind of display that made people murmur about fairy tale weddings. I sat at the long table watching relatives toast Sophia, my mother preening at every compliment, my father raising his glass as if he had engineered all of it. I told myself to breathe, to play along, to let Sophia have her night. But my father had other ideas. Between bites of roast lamb and sips of wine, he tapped his glass for attention. Now he said, leaning forward with a broad grin, "A wedding is not complete without a worthy gift for the bride. Something meaningful, something lasting." His words hung heavy, though the room chuckled politely, expecting a charming anecdote. I knew better. His eyes slid toward me, sharp with intention. He wasn't talking about jewelry or a honeymoon fund. He was talking about me. Sophia leaned closer, her veil of sweetness intact, her perfume thick in the air. "You won't let me down, right, sis?" she whispered, her hand brushing my arm like we were co-conspirators. Her voice dripped with practiced innocence, but underneath I heard the demand. I forced my face to stay neutral, though the air between us felt like a noose tightening. Then came my mother's voice, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, pitched in a half laugh that didn't disguise the sharpness. "That 25% you hold," she said, tilting her head as though teasing. "It's too much for one person. Don't you think it's time to share with family? After all, family is everything." Laughter trickled around us like a knife sliding across glass. To them it was just banter, but to me it was the opening move of a trap I had felt building for weeks. I lifted my glass and pretended to sip, my knuckles white around the stem. My heart thudded with a mix of rage and disbelief. They had reduced my 10 years of blood and sweat into a casual joke over dessert. They were testing me in front of everyone, setting the stage for something bigger, darker. My father's grin, Sophia's wide eyes, my mother's faux laughter. It was a coordinated performance, and I was the unwilling prop. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I had survived rejection from investors, nights with nothing but coffee to fuel me betrayal that would have crushed others. I would not break here, not at their dinner table, not in this theater of manipulation. I raised my glass higher, offering a toast of my own, my voice steady, though my insides burned. To Sophia and her future I said the words hollow in my throat. The table clapped, oblivious to the storm building beneath the surface. My father leaned back, satisfied, my mother smirked, and Sophia rested her head against her fiancé's shoulder as if nothing had passed between us. But I knew this was only the beginning. They had tested the waters, and tomorrow at the wedding they would drag me into the deep. Blood surged in my ears, pounding like drums. I wanted to slam my glass down, to shout that my 25% was not theirs to take, that I was not the family's silent purse. But I bit it back, pressing my lips into a polite smile. The taste of restraint was bitter, but I swallowed it whole. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to smile. I remember sitting at that long mahogany table after the pre-wedding dinner, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my smile frozen in place. My blood was still simmering from my parents' insinuations, from Sophia's smug little whisper about not letting her down. I swallowed. It all smiled politely, and excused myself before the anger turned into words I couldn't take back. That night, back in my hotel room, I did what I had always done. I sacrificed quietly. It had become second nature, so ingrained in me that sometimes I didn't even recognize it as sacrifice until the sting of resentment arrived later. The first sacrifice was the money. Weeks before the wedding, Dad had hinted that the costs were ballooning. Sophia deserved the best, he said, and apparently the best came with a six-figure price tag. I transferred $50,000 into their account, no questions asked. $50,000. It wasn't pocket change. It was the kind of money that could have bought me another car, funded a new product line for my company, or even gone towards something indulgent for myself, something I'd never allowed. But instead, I wired it straight to my parents, who treated it like a formality. There was no thank you call, no acknowledgement. Just silence, as though I'd done nothing more than drop a $5 bill into a collection plate. I told myself it was for Sophia, that maybe for once my parents would see I was trying. But deep down, I knew better. They would chalk it up as something they were entitled to. The second sacrifice came in the form of my connections. Over the years, I had worked tirelessly to build a network, not just in business but in media and publishing. People returned my calls because I had proven my value in boardrooms and negotiations. It was power I had earned, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I decided to use that power to help Sophia. I reached out to a colleague at one of the most prestigious bridal magazines in the country. I spoke about Sophia's wedding as if it were the event of the season, highlighting the grandeur, the details, the love story. Within a week, a glossy feature was confirmed. Sophia's wedding would be showcased alongside those of celebrities and billionaires. When I told her the news, she squealed, clapped her hands, and rushed off to tell her friends. She didn't even look at me long enough to say thank you. My mother's reaction. Well, that's what sisters are for. As if my carefully built reputation and years of sweat equity were nothing more than tools for Sophia's convenience. The third sacrifice came in the form of something more personal, something no one else could have done. I had accumulated points over years of travel, red-eye flights, endless conferences, back-to-back meetings across continents. Those points were my badge of honor, proof of every sleepless night and every deal closed in foreign boardrooms. I had dreamed of cashing them in for myself one day, perhaps for a trip to Paris or a retreat in Bali, something that felt like a reward. But when I learned Sophia and Brian had settled for a basic honeymoon suite, I made a call. I used my points to upgrade them to the most luxurious suite in the resort. A place with oceanfront views, private butlers, and champagne waiting on ice. When I confirmed it, the concierge asked if I was celebrating something special. Yes, I said quietly, though the words tasted bitter. My sister's wedding. I never told Sophia it was me. I let her believe it was the hotel's generosity or perhaps her fiancé's surprise. She gushed about it to our relatives, glowing with pride. I stood in the corner listening, smiling, biting my tongue. It wasn't worth it to correct her. My sacrifice was invisible by design because that was the role I had been cast in since childhood. What stung the most wasn't the money, the connections, or the points. It was the absence of acknowledgement. No one stopped to think about what those sacrifices cost me. They weren't just financial, they were pieces of myself, pieces I had carved away in the hope of being seen. My parents never said, "We're grateful." Sophia never looked me in the eyes and recognized the effort. To them it was expected, inevitable. I was the one who provided, who carried the weight, who made things easier for everyone else. And yet when it came to recognition, when it came to love, I was still invisible. That night, as I sat by the hotel window watching the New York skyline glitter, I realized how deeply entrenched my invisibility was in their eyes. I could have given Sophia the moon, and they would have found a way to diminish it. They would have told me it was the least I could do. And maybe that was why the anger simmered deeper than ever before. Because I knew no matter what I gave, they would never see me for who I was. The ungrateful daughter, the unfeminine sister, the one who had to prove herself over and over again, while being dismissed every single time. Still, I couldn't help but hope in some small, foolish part of myself that maybe these sacrifices would soften them. Maybe on the day of the wedding they'd look at me differently, even for just a moment. Maybe they would finally say, "We're proud of you." But as I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, a cold truth pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Hope had always been the trap, the bait they dangled to keep me giving. And every time I fell for it. The next day, I would find out just how wrong I was to expect even a sliver of gratitude. For when the spotlight turned, it wouldn't illuminate my sacrifices. It would expose a scheme so cruel, it would make every dollar, every favor, every sleepless night feel like nothing at all. And the worst part? They planned to use my love for them as a weapon against me. No one said thank you, not a single word. It was as if I didn't exist. I walked into the reception hall carrying the weight of the week's silent sacrifices, each one carved into my memory like an invisible scar. $50,000 transferred without a word. Connections called in to guarantee Sophia's wedding would be splashed across glossy magazine pages, and even my hard-earned travel points spent on the honeymoon suite. I told myself these things were enough to prove that I cared, even when no one else seemed to notice. But the moment I stepped into that glittering hall, I knew I had been naive. The music, the chandeliers, the polished smiles, none of it could hide the knives waiting beneath the velvet. It started with a voice sharp enough to slice through the chatter. "That dress looks like something for a board meeting." My aunt's words cut through the air, and heads turned toward me as though she had made a public announcement. I looked down at the navy silk dress I had chosen with such care. It was tasteful, modest, deliberately understated so that I wouldn't draw attention from Sophia. But to them, it wasn't elegance. It was ammunition. Their laughter, low and knowing, slithered through the tables, wrapping around me like a noose. Before I could steady myself, another whisper floated into the air, crueler than the first. "She's 32 and still unmarried. Pitiful, really." The words spread like fire, feeding on every sideways glance and muffled laugh. Someone else added, "All those years in San Francisco and not a single ring on her finger. She must have chosen work over love." The tone was heavy with mock pity, but the sneer beneath it was unmistakable. I gripped the stem of my glass tighter, forcing my expression into calm indifference, while my chest burned with rage. To them, none of my achievements mattered. The company I had built from nothing, the millions in contracts I had fought for, the independence I had carved out in a world that had tried to break me. None of it erased the one unforgivable crime in their eyes, that I had not married. Just when I thought I could hold myself together, a cousin slid into the seat beside me, his smile as false as the champagne bubbles rising in his glass. He leaned close, his voice dripping with feigned warmth. "Sophia's been talking about your company," he said smoothly. "She really cares about it. She's sure her big sister will share some of it, to help her start her new life. That's what family is for, isn't it?" My stomach turned as his words sank in. It wasn't concern for me. It wasn't admiration for what I had built. It was hunger, pure and shameless, thinly disguised as familial duty. I met his gaze and saw the calculation lurking there. They weren't just mocking me anymore. They were circling, preparing to take. I swallowed back the fury clawing up my throat. Years of practice had taught me how to mask the storm inside, to smile through insults, to remain silent when silence was safer than truth. I forced my lips into a curve, nodding, as if his suggestion was reasonable, as if I hadn't heard the poison beneath every word. My blood boiled, but I held it in. Because in that moment, I realized something chilling. The whispers weren't accidents, and the ridicule wasn't random. It was all leading somewhere. Every laugh, every jab, every hint was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something public, something humiliating. I thought I was braced for anything, but I was wrong. I didn't know they were preparing to stab me in the back right there on stage. The chatter in the hall swelled into a low hum, and I sat frozen in my chair trying to shake off the sting of whispered insults. I had endured mockery my entire life, but something about tonight felt heavier, more orchestrated. My cousin's words about Sophia being so interested in my company lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I could sense it in the air, their laughter, the pointed comments, the sidelong glances. It was all leading somewhere. And then my father stood up, lifting the microphone as if he were about to toast the bride. The music softened. The light shifted slightly, and the room's attention gravitated toward him. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. This wasn't just a toast. I knew it before he opened his mouth. Tonight he began, his voice booming with the authority I had grown up fearing. Is not only the union of two wonderful people, but also a moment for family to show what family means. His gaze swept the room, pausing on me with the weight of expectation before shifting back to the crowd. And my eldest daughter, Emma, has chosen to honor her sister with the greatest gift of all, 25% of her company shares. Applause erupted like gunfire, clapping hands and cheers crashing into my ears. My stomach dropped. My father hadn't just hinted at it in private, he had declared it in front of hundreds of people. A public decree. A trap I hadn't seen until the jaws snapped shut. I felt the blood drain from my face as my eyes darted to Sophia. She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Oh my God, Emma," she gasped, her voice shaking, perfectly staged for maximum effect. "I can't believe you'd do this for me." Guests around her dabbed at their eyes, whispering about what a touching moment this was. Strangers I had never met were now looking at me with admiration, as though I had just crowned Sophia with my life's work. They couldn't see the steel trap hidden beneath the ribbons. They couldn't hear the grinding of my teeth as I forced myself not to scream. Then, as if to seal the performance, a man near the front of the room leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the air of someone who belonged in boardrooms, not at a family wedding. I didn't recognize him, but the nod was deliberate, measured, as if confirming the announcement. People nearby glanced at him and seemed reassured. My heart lurched. Who was he? Why was he here? And why did his simple gesture feel like the final nail in a coffin? My father basked in the applause, soaking up the admiration as if he were the generous one. "This is what true family sacrifice looks like," he proclaimed, his voice rising over the clapping. "Sophia deserves nothing less, and Emma's gift will ensure her future is secure." The words rolled out smoothly, but all I heard was the echo of betrayal. My hard-earned company, the empire I had built from sleepless nights and near breakdowns, was now being paraded as a trinket to display Sophia's worth. They had turned me into a prop in her fairy tale, stripping me of dignity in front of everyone. I tried to move to rise, but my body felt cemented to the chair. Around me, people leaned in murmuring praise and admiration. What a generous sister. Such a selfless act. She must really love Sophia. Each word was a dagger twisted deeper into my chest. I felt my throat tighten, my palms damp with sweat. Inside I was screaming, but outwardly I forced my lips into something resembling a polite smile. Years of training in silence had taught me to hide my true feelings, but never had the mask felt heavier than it did in that moment. Across the room, Sophia looked radiant, her tears glistening like jewels under the light. She played her part perfectly, basking in the adoration while I sat there suffocating under the weight of a lie I hadn't chosen. And then my father's eyes found mine again, narrowing slightly, daring me to contradict him. The message was clear. Go along with this, or you will be painted as the villain who ruined your sister's wedding. He had boxed me in, forcing me into silence with the power of public perception. If I spoke out, I would look cruel. If I stayed quiet, I would lose a piece of myself forever. The man who had nodded remained expressionless, but the certainty of his gesture gnawed at me. Silent partner, investor, puppet master. Whatever his role it was tied to my company and by extension to me. He was part of the trap, part of the reason this announcement had been delivered so boldly as if it were already sealed. I couldn't shake the dread that his presence meant the web was wider than I realized. The applause eventually died down, leaving only the sound of my pounding heart. My father held the microphone like a judge, waiting for the final word. Sophia dabbed her eyes with a napkin, gazing at me as if begging me to confirm her miracle gift. Guests leaned forward, their anticipation thick in the air. And then it hit me. The silence wasn't an accident. They were waiting for me to nod, to confirm, to surrender the core of who I was. Every eye in that hall turned to me, expectant, unrelenting. The weight of their stares pressed down until I could barely breathe. My hands trembled as I set my glass on the table, forcing myself to lift my chin. All eyes were on me, waiting for the nod. The hall was heavy with silence, all those eyes boring into me, waiting for my submission. My father stood at the center of it, still holding the microphone like a judge presiding over my fate. Sophia looked at me through tear-glossed lashes, playing the role of the grateful bride, and that stranger in the front row, the one who had nodded, sat with the stillness of a man who already believed the verdict had been decided. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I could almost hear my father's voice daring me to confirm his lie, to gift away a quarter of my life's work with nothing but a nod. I let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer, then I drew in a breath, steady and cold. No, I said, my voice cutting through the air like glass shattering. The word wasn't loud, but it carried slicing through the hush until the hall seemed to gasp with me. I straightened in my chair, my chin lifted. I never agreed to that. There is no such gift. The room erupted in murmurs, a low tide of disbelief and judgment rolling over me. I caught fragments as the guests leaned toward one another, voices hushed but sharp enough to pierce. Did she just say no? How selfish. On her sister's wedding day of all times. Some shook their heads. Others gave me looks heavy with disdain, as though I had just shattered a sacred ritual instead of defending what was mine. Sophia's tears, so convincing moments before, seemed to falter. She blinked rapidly, her expression flickering between confusion and rage before she buried her face in her hands again. I don't understand, she whispered loud enough for the nearest tables to hear her shoulders trembling. Why would you humiliate me like this? Gasps rippled through the crowd. To them, she looked like a wronged bride abandoned in her moment of joy by the one person meant to support her. To me, she was an actress who had just overplayed her role. My father's smile froze, then hardened into a glare that could have turned steel to dust. He stepped forward, microphone still in hand, and leaned toward me. His voice was low, meant only for me, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "Don't ruin this day," he hissed. "Do you understand? This is bigger than you." His words were a command, the same tone he had used to control me all my life, but I no longer bowed to it. Before I could respond, my mother slid up beside me, her face stretched into a mask of calm for the crowd. But her eyes burned. She bent down close enough that I felt her breath against my ear. "Do not do this," she whispered sharply. "Think of your sister. Think of the family. You'll destroy everything." She pulled back, plastering on a smile for the watching guests, her hand resting on my shoulder like a vice disguised as affection. I pushed her hand away. "No," I repeated louder this time, letting it echo. "This is my company, my work, my sacrifice. It doesn't belong to Sophia. It doesn't belong to you. I will not give it away." My words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The murmurs swelled, the judgment thickening, but I didn't care. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, I wasn't their scapegoat. I was standing firm and immovable. The hall had become a stage and I their unwilling villain. Guests whispered, glancing between Sophia's trembling figure and my cold defiance. A woman clutched her pearls. A man muttered, "How cruel." The sound of tutting tongues clicked against the backdrop of music that suddenly felt grotesquely cheerful. I stood at the center of their scrutiny, but I would not bend. My father's knuckles whitened around the microphone. "Don't make a scene." He warned, his voice dropping into that dangerous register I remembered from childhood. "Don't destroy your sister's happiness because of your pride. Smile, agree, and we'll discuss later." Later. I almost laughed. Later meant never. Later meant erasure. Later meant waking up tomorrow to find 25% of my company stolen under my own name. My father had never left space for discussion, only for surrender. I stared at him, my face expressionless but my heart pounding. "No," I said one final time, each letter deliberate, unshakable. The gasps rose again, sharper now, mingling with Sophia's sobs and the disapproving stares of people who would never understand what was at stake. I stood alone against them all, a wall they could not breach. And just as I opened my mouth to speak again, to lay bare the truth that this was nothing but a cruel spectacle, I felt a sudden sting explode across my cheek. I hadn't even finished my sentence when my mother's hand came down. The moment my mother's hand struck my cheek, the world seemed to freeze. The crack of skin against skin rang through the ballroom with such force that the chandeliers trembled. My head jerked sideways from the impact, and in that split second of stunned silence, I felt the sting blaze across my face like fire. My diamond earring, the one I had bought with my own hard-earned money after closing my first international deal, flew free and clattered across the marble floor. The sound of it hitting the ground felt louder than the music had been seconds earlier, louder even than the applause that had filled the hall when my father announced his ambush. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, wide with shock, hungry for scandal. I could hear the thrum of blood in my ears, each pulse pounding against my burning skin. My mother's hand still hung in the air, fingers stiff as if even she could not quite believe what she had done. But she had done it. She had chosen humiliation, violence, and control over dignity. Then, as if on cue, the whispers began to slither through the silence. A cousin's gasp turned into a murmur. A guest's phone camera light blinked red, recording everything. In the corner of my vision, I caught the unmistakable posture of Brian's younger brother, his phone propped discreetly against a champagne flute. A crimson circle on the screen betrayed it. He was live streaming. My private hell had just been unleashed for the world to see. And still I stood. I did not cry. I did not shout. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I forced my body into stillness, every muscle trembling with restraint. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down to retrieve my fallen earring. The marble floor was cold beneath my fingertips, the diamond catching the light like a defiant spark. I fixed it back into place, my movements calm and measured, as though this were nothing more than an inconvenience, not a wound broadcast for thousands to witness. Gasps rippled as I straightened. I could feel the weight of their eyes pressing into me, some filled with pity, others with judgment, but most with fascination. I saw a woman at table 7 raise her phone higher, angling for a clearer shot. She smiled faintly, like someone watching a car crash she couldn't look away from. My humiliation had become entertainment. And then there was Sophia. My sister, the glowing bride in her gown of white lace and pearls, her mascaraed lashes clumped with tears for the cameras. Her lips trembled, but not from sorrow. As I caught her gaze, I saw it, the tiniest curl at the corner of her mouth. A smile. She hid it, quickly ducking her face against Brian's chest, but I had seen it. Beneath her performance of innocence and shock, there was triumph. She wanted this. She had orchestrated it. And my mother had played her role flawlessly. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, that hollow pit carved out by years of dismissal, betrayal, and erasure. But layered over it now was something new, an icy clarity. They had chosen to expose me, to strip me down before strangers, to force me into a corner with nowhere to run. What they did not understand was that I was not the little girl they had once silenced. I was not the daughter who quietly gave up her scholarship so her sister could twirl in a prom dress. I was not the woman they could guilt into surrendering her life's work. The slap had not broken me. It had crystallized me. Around me, the murmurs grew into an ugly chorus. How selfish. On her sister's wedding day, ungrateful girl. Their words stung, but less than the sting on my cheek. Because while they judged me, they did not know me. They saw only the version of me my parents had painted all my life. The difficult one, the ambitious one, the woman who never knew her place. And I knew in that moment, if I stayed in that ballroom, I would be trapped forever in their story, not mine. So I turned. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked steadily, purposefully toward the exit. Behind me, the hall erupted, some calling after me, others gasping, others recording still. My father's voice boomed through the microphone, calling my name, trying to reel me back into his performance. My mother's hiss followed me, sharp as broken glass. Get back here. But I did not look back. I kept walking, each step heavier with certainty. My clutch was cool in my palm, my phone inside vibrating with incoming notifications. I already knew the video was spreading like wildfire. But I also knew something else. I wasn't done. This wasn't the end. By the time I reached the double doors of the ballroom, I had made my decision. I slipped my phone out the screen, glowing against my bruised skin. My fingers dialed the number I had memorized years ago, the one I had been told to use only if they ever pushed me too far. I pressed it to my ear. My voice was steady, my heart as sharp as glass. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't beg. I simply walked out and pressed the call button. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply walked out, phone in hand, and dialed the number. The air outside the ballroom felt thin, almost poisonous with the weight of what had just happened. My cheeks still burned where my mother's hand had struck, and I could still hear the echo of her slap bouncing off the chandeliers in my mind. Guests were whispering behind the doors I had just walked through, and I knew the recording was already spreading like wildfire. But I kept my pace, steady heels clicking against the marble floor as I pulled out my phone. My hand didn't tremble as I scrolled to the one name I had promised myself I would call, only if I was cornered. Tonight, I had been shoved into a corner so tight I could barely breathe. I hit dial. When David Morgan answered, his voice was sharp, alert, as though he had been waiting. "Emma," he said, and I could hear the anger in his tone before I even spoke. I told him what had happened in as few words as I could manage. The slap, the public humiliation, the demand for 25% of my company as some grotesque wedding gift. For a moment there was only silence on the other end, but I could picture his face, the hard set of his jaw, the steel in his eyes. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled, though I caught the tremor of fury beneath it. "I saw it," he said. "The video is everywhere already. They think they can strip you of what you built. They think they can break you in front of 200 witnesses. Not while I draw breath." Hearing him speak with that conviction brought a rush of memories. Years earlier, when I was still clawing for seed funding and every investor laughed me out of their offices, David had been the only one to believe in me. Not because I was polished or connected, my family had never lifted a finger for me, but because he saw my fire, my grit. Back then, over late-night coffee at a diner in Palo Alto, he had leaned across the table and said, "If they ever try to corner you, call me. Don't hesitate. I know the kind of people you come from. I've dealt with your father before, and I won't let them take what's yours." At the time, I had tucked those words away as a comfort, never imagining I would actually need to act on them. Now they roared back with all the force of a lifeline. "I'm sorry to drag you into this," I whispered, my voice low, though no one was near. My throat ached from holding back tears, but I refused to let them fall. I had been humiliated enough for one night. "Don't be sorry," he cut in. "I've been waiting for this. Your father owes me more than you know. Decades ago, he made promises he never kept, betrayed, contracts he swore to honor. I kept my silence because I thought it wasn't worth the fight. But tonight he crossed the last line. His tone darkened until it felt like a blade sliding across the phone line. He put his hands through your mother and turned the crowd against you, his own daughter. And worse, he tried to extort your company. No. That debt is due. With interest. The words rattled through me like thunder. I hadn't known the full story of what tied David to my father, though I had suspected there was more than business respect between them. Now the truth seeped out jagged and bitter. My father had wronged him long before I ever built my company, and David had quietly carried that wound. But it wasn't revenge for himself that drove his voice. Now it was fury for me, for the injustice I had endured. It was as if he had decided to channel all those years of betrayal into protecting me in this moment. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. David didn't hesitate. "What I should have done years ago. I'll be there within the hour, and when I walk into that ballroom, your parents will learn the meaning of consequences. They thought humiliating you would make you weak. But I'll turn their humiliation into ash, and the entire room will see who you truly are, and who they are." My breath caught as I realized this wasn't just about salvaging my dignity, this was about turning the entire narrative on its head. They had tried to strip me bare in front of their world. David was promising to strip them instead. I pressed my free hand against my still throbbing cheek, grounding myself. "They won't expect you," I murmured. "That's the point," he said. "And Emma, listen to me, do not let their words tonight make you doubt what you've achieved. That company is worth $50 million because of you. Every contract, every sleepless night, every risk that was you. No one can take that away no matter how they try. You're not the invisible daughter anymore. You are the storm they can't contain." His words sank deep, filling the hollowness my family had carved into me for years. For the first time that night, I felt not just defiance, but strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing you are no longer standing alone. We ended the call with a final promise. "Stay calm. I'm coming. And when I do your father's debt, your family's cruelty will be paid in full." I slipped my phone back into my clutch, my pulse steady now, my steps measured. I didn't know what scene would unfold when David walked through those doors. But I knew one thing with every fiber of my being. Whatever chaos came next, it would no longer be my burden to bear alone. I squared my shoulders, ready to face whatever fallout the night still had in store. I didn't know his arrival would turn everything upside down. The air inside the wedding hall was still buzzing with whispers after I had slipped away, but I didn't have to be there to know it. The sting on my cheek burned like fire, yet it wasn't the pain that consumed me. It was the humiliation. My mother had struck me in front of a hall full of relatives, colleagues, and strangers, and now, with the video spreading like wildfire, there was no taking it back. I had made the call and David had answered. He hadn't spoken long, but every word carried the weight of thunder. Now, as I stood just beyond the gilded doors of the reception, heart pounding in my chest, I heard the sudden hush ripple across the crowd inside. The heavy doors creaked open. Gasps echoed like a wave breaking against the shore. I didn't need to crane my neck to know why. A voice broke through the silence, sharp and breathless. David Morgan guests, who had been sneering at me minutes earlier, now pressed forward, some holding their phones higher to capture the moment, others shrinking back in shock at the unexpected name. David filled the doorway with a commanding presence that seemed to dim the chandeliers above. His tall frame, tailored suit, and sharp eyes radiated authority, but it was the aura of power he carried, the kind that could make or break fortunes, that turned the air heavy. He wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, both in immaculate suits carrying leather portfolios. Their steps were purposeful, rehearsed like soldiers marching into enemy territory. My chest tightened. My chest. This wasn't just a man keeping a promise. This was a storm I had unleashed. I turned my gaze toward my mother. Her face, moments ago flushed with righteous anger, now drained of all color. Her lips trembled, her hand clutching at the pearls around her neck as if they could anchor her in place. She knew what his presence meant. She knew the weight of his name. And she feared it. The guests murmured louder. Some recognized him instantly. David Morgan, the investor whispered about in magazines, the man whose influence stretched across continents. Others were clueless, but sensed his gravity shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even the groom's family, previously smug and complacent, exchanged uneasy looks. David didn't waste time. He strode into the hall, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, echoing through the silence. His lawyers flanked him, unsmiling, their eyes scanning the crowd like hawks. Each step he took tightened the coil of tension in the room until it felt ready to snap. My father, who had always carried himself like a king, in his little empire, stood frozen by the head table. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. I caught Sophia's expression too. She sat at the bridal table in her expensive gown, mascara streaked from her earlier performance of faux tears. For a heartbeat, she looked triumphant until her eyes landed on David. The color drained from her cheeks almost as quickly as it had from my mother's. Whatever script they had prepared, this was not part of it. David came to a stop in the center of the room, directly beneath the crystal chandelier. He glanced around, his gaze slicing through the crowd like a blade. People lowered their eyes rather than meet his. When his gaze finally settled on my mother, she took a shaky step back. She had raised her hand to strike me, but now her hands quivered at her sides, powerless. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then David's voice cut through it, low, deliberate, and chilling enough to still every whisper. His tone was not loud, but every syllable seemed to echo off the marble walls, commanding absolute attention. I saw the whole thing he said, his voice ice cold. The hall froze again, the words sinking like a stone into deep water. Every eye swung from him to my mother, then to me and back again. The reckoning had arrived, and it was standing in the middle of the room with two lawyers at his side. I saw the whole thing. His voice rang out cold as steel. David's words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The murmur of the crowd died instantly, as though every throat had closed at once. My mother's face was pale, her hand frozen in midair, and my father's knuckles whitened as he gripped the back of a chair. David let the silence stretch until it threatened to suffocate everyone. Then he turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. He gave the smallest nod, not one of comfort, but of recognition, a public acknowledgement of who I was and what I had built. Then his voice came again, steady, cold, deliberate. For those of you who don't know, he began his gaze cutting to the guests. Emma is not merely a guest at this wedding. She is not here as just a daughter or a sister. She is the co-founder of a $50 million company. 25% of that company belongs to her and her alone, legally, contractually, and irrevocably. No amount of pressure, no tears, no public charades can strip her of it. That is the law. A ripple spread across the hall, gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward. My father's lips parted, perhaps to object, but David silenced him with a glance so sharp it could cut glass. He continued, his tone like iron. And yet, what I saw here tonight was an attempt to humiliate and coerce her. In front of 50 witnesses, in front of cameras, with hands laid on her violence plain for everyone to see. Several heads turned instinctively toward my mother. She shrank back, her face flushed now, not with rage but with shame, or perhaps fear. A cousin near the front clutched her phone tighter. The red recording light blinked, proof that the moment had been captured in more than one angle. David's lawyer stepped forward, sliding a tablet from his case and holding it up. The live stream already has over 10,000 views, he said evenly. We have multiple recordings. All of them are saved. The hall erupted in murmurs again. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others outright pulled their own phones out to check the feed. I caught sight of Sophia at the bridal table, her mascara streaked and her smile frozen, her act of innocence unraveling as the gravity of what had been done became undeniable. David raised a hand and the room fell silent once more. His voice grew colder still. If an apology is not made here now in front of every witness present, I will have no choice but to escalate. I will call a board meeting not tomorrow, not next week, but tonight. I will lay out every detail, the coercion, the assault, the attempt to illegally seize a shareholder's equity. And I assure you, directors will act. Investors will act. The fallout will be swift and absolute. My father stiffened at those words. He knew what that meant. His company's fragile alliances, the partnerships he had spent decades cultivating, could vanish overnight with David's single phone call. He swallowed, but no words came. David wasn't finished. He took a slow step forward, and though his voice never rose, it carried the weight of thunder. I've seen empires topple for far less, and I will not hesitate to bring every resource at my disposal to ensure Emma is protected and this disgrace is corrected. He paused, then his eyes narrowing, his tone dropping so low it chilled the room. So choose. Apologize here and now, or watch everything you hold dear collapse before your eyes. The chandeliers seemed to flicker as the silence that followed pressed down on the hall. Guests held their breath, waiting for someone to speak, but no one dared. Even the music from the string quartet had stopped, bows frozen in midair. The only sound was the faint clink of a glass someone nervously set down on a table. The room sank into a deathly silence. The silence David commanded lingered heavy, thick as a shroud, until the room itself seemed to buckle under its weight. Then the first crack appeared. A pair of distinguished men in tuxedos, guests I recognized as investors from New York, rose from their seats without a word. Their wives followed, clutching their purses, avoiding eye contact with my family as they swept toward the exit. The sound of the doors opening and shutting again echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating stillness. That was all it took. One by one, other guests began excusing themselves, chairs, scraping whispered apologies left in their wake. It wasn't a party anymore. It was a sinking ship, and no one wanted to go down with it. The groom's parents sat rigid at the front, faces twisted in barely concealed fury. The groom's mother leaned close to her husband, her voice sharp enough to carry despite her attempt at discretion. This is a disgrace, a public circus. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might break, and then he turned to my father, his words a dagger disguised as politeness. This union was supposed to elevate both families. Instead, we've been humiliated. The bridegroom. Brian shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching against the tablecloth, but he said nothing. His family's anger was clear enough. I felt a bitter swell of satisfaction. The empire my parents had worked so hard to parade was unraveling thread by thread, right in the room they had chosen to crown Sophia Queen. The guests they had hoped to impress were now slipping away in disgust, muttering into their phones, sending texts that would ripple through social circles before the night was even over. But the true blow came faster than anyone anticipated. Phones buzzed throughout the hall. Screens lit up. Murmurs rose as people began to glance at headlines that were already circulating. Photos of my mother's hand raised against me, frozen mid-slap, had made it to the internet. Clips from different angles were being shared with alarming speed, accompanied by captions that read like judgment carved in stone, wealthy family's wedding scandal, bride's sister, slapped over fortune abuse and greed on display at high society ceremony. It was viral before the cake had even been cut. I saw Sophia's face blanch as she realized that her picture-perfect day had already been rewritten as a scandal for millions to consume. My father's lips pressed into a grim line and his hand shook as he tried to steady his phone, scanning the headlines that twisted his family's reputation into ridicule. And then, from the corner of the room, a man stood. Until now, he had been unnoticed by most, his tailored suit blending into the crowd. But when he moved, heads turned. His eyes met my father's, and a small, knowing smile curved his lips. It was the man who had nodded during my father's announcement earlier, the one I hadn't recognized, but whose approval had unnerved me. David's eyes flicked toward him briefly, sharp and assessing, as if confirming something he had suspected. Whispers swelled. A name began circulating, passed from guest to guest until it reached me in a hushed rush. He wasn't just some bystander. He wasn't just a business associate. He was a creditor. The creditor. The one who held the paper, the man whose money my father had borrowed under my company's name years before, whose quiet patience had always puzzled me. The silent partner was no partner at all. He was a shark who had been circling, biding his time. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just public humiliation anymore. This was financial reckoning. My father's eyes darted toward the man, and his expression faltered as the realization settled. He knew the mask had slipped. The man reached casually into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. A second later, my father's own phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down, and his face drained of all color. The name that appeared was unmistakable. Guests craned their necks, sensing the moment, watching, as my father's trembling hand hovered over the screen but didn't dare answer. My father's face turned ghostly pale when the creditor's name lit up his phone. David did not give my father a chance to recover from the sight of that name glowing on his phone. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space as though he had seized control of the very air. The murmur of guests rippled uneasily, but David's voice cut clean through it, cold and deliberate, each word aimed like a blade. This spectacle tonight, this attempt to force Emma's hand, is only the surface. The truth runs deeper, much deeper. Heads turned. Some of the guests leaned in their expressions, caught between fascination and horror, as if they could sense that what was about to be revealed would leave scars far beyond this wedding day. My father stiffened, his jaw tightening, but his silence condemned him more than words ever could. David's gaze locked onto him. Years ago, when your company was faltering, when your debts were climbing faster than you could pay them, you made a choice. Instead of standing on your own 2 feet, you used your daughter's name, Emma's name, to secure loans you had no right to take. You tied her reputation and her future to your failures. And you did it without her knowledge. A gasp cut through the crowd. Guests shifted in their seats, horrified eyes turning toward me. My stomach tightened as the weight of his words sank in, even though part of me had suspected the truth for years. My father's fists curled against the tablecloth, his knuckles bone white, but still he said nothing. David wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward my mother, and the heat in his eyes burned hotter than fire. "And you," he said, his voice dropping into a tone so sharp it silenced even the whispering. "You forged her signature. You bled money out of her accounts, pretending to act for her benefit, but every dollar you took went into propping up a crumbling empire. You sold your own child's future to buy yourself another season of false grandeur." My mother's lips parted in protest, but the words caught in her throat. A dozen eyes turned toward her, and the guilt in her expression betrayed her before she could speak. Her face twisted, and she tried to summon indignation, but the sweat along her hairline and the tremor in her hands betrayed the truth David had already laid bare. David stepped back slightly, sweeping his gaze across the audience, ensuring no one missed the final blow. And that's why tonight was staged as it was. This public charade, this announcement of a gift of 25% of Emma's company to Sophia, was never about generosity. It was never about family. It was about desperation. They needed those shares, her shares, to bail out the debts they drowned themselves in. Without them, their company is finished. The words detonated in the hall like dynamite. Guests erupted in chatter, some outraged, some gleeful at the scandal unfolding before their eyes. The groom's family exchanged furious whispers, their disappointment turning swiftly into anger at having been entangled in this mess. A few guests rose from their seats, entirely shaking their heads in disgust. Phones lit up again, fingers typing fast, no doubt feeding the wildfire that was already consuming my family's reputation online. My father finally slammed a fist onto the table, the sound cracking like thunder. "Lies," he barked, but even his voice shook as the word left his mouth. His eyes darted wildly, searching for allies in the room, but found only skepticism and condemnation staring back at him. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for his arm, but the gesture looked more like desperation than support. In that moment, I felt something in me shift. For years I had carried their cruelty, their belittling, their insistence that I was worth less than Sophia. I had swallowed their insults, their thefts, their betrayals. And now here they stood, stripped bare before the very people they had sought to impress. Their lies exposed their schemes, shattered their pride, crumbling in real time. David folded his hands calmly, his lawyers flanking him like shadows. "I don't make accusations. I cannot prove," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Every forgery, every loan, every false signature, it's all documented. If you doubt me, I will show the evidence here and now." The guests roared again, some urging him to reveal it, others whispering in disbelief. My mother sank lower in her seat, her eyes darting to the exits as though she might flee. My father's face reddened, veins bulging at his temples, but he could not summon a defense strong enough to withstand the truth. The wedding hall erupted, and I could only give a bitter smile. The hall had barely begun to settle after David's revelations when another storm rolled in, one no one had seen coming. The groom's family sat stiff and cold, their anger simmering beneath the surface. Brian's mother, her lips pressed thin, leaned across the table and demanded, "What else don't we know about your family?" Her tone was razor-sharp, slicing through the heavy air. My father tried to stammer some defense, but her gaze shifted suddenly to Sophia. There was a flicker of suspicion in her eyes that made Sophia falter for the first time all evening. The groom's father pulled a folder from his briefcase, a folder it seemed he had brought just in case. He laid it flat on the table and slid a single page across to his son. Brian's hands shook as he read it, then his jaw clenched. The page trembled in his grip. He turned to Sophia, his voice cutting through the silence, flat and hard. "You signed a prenup designed to give you access to assets that were never yours." The guests gasped. Sophia's painted face drained of color as whispers ricocheted around the room. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but none came. Her father's disgrace had already tainted the evening, but now her own secret betrayal rose to the surface, undeniable and damning. Brian wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, swiped, and pressed play. A familiar voice spilled from the speakers. Sophia's voice, sharp with arrogance, laced with vanity. "Of course I'll get everything out of this. He's just the next step. Between the prenup and Emma's shares, I'll have more than I ever dreamed." A collective gasp rattled the room. Heads whipped toward Sophia. Some guests covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. Sophia lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone, but Brian held it high, his face a mask of betrayal and disgust. "This," he spat, "is who I was supposed to marry." Sophia collapsed into her chair, her composure gone, her sobs sharp and shrill. But no one offered her sympathy. The guests who had once fawned over her designer gown and lavish decorations now recoiled, their eyes filled with judgment and disdain. The groom's family rose as one. His father declared in a voice that rang across the hall, "This wedding is over. We will not be tied to deceit, fraud, and humiliation." Chairs scraped as they pushed away their entourage following them, leaving Sophia crumpled at the bridal table, her veil slipping off her head. The exodus didn't stop with them. Other guests took their cue and began leaving as well. The grand hall, once filled with chatter and laughter, now echoed with the shuffle of feet and the slam of doors. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago. Their instruments lay silent as the celebration collapsed into chaos. Plates of untouched food sat cooling on the tables, champagne flutes abandoned mid-toast. I watched as everything my family had tried to build that night, every illusion of power, every desperate attempt to control me, every lie they had stacked like fragile cards, came crashing down. The bride, who had been crowned the jewel of the evening, now sat weeping into her hands, her mask of perfection torn apart by her own vanity. It was brutal, it was public, and it was final. The fairy tale wedding turned into a nightmare. The moment Sophia's carefully crafted facade crumbled, the wedding dissolved into chaos. Guests whispered, some stormed out. Others simply stood frozen as the truth about her prenup and secret recordings spread across the ballroom like poison in the air. For me, it was vindication, a moment that exposed the years of manipulation and favoritism. But as I left that shattered hall, I underestimated just how far my mother would go to claw back control. She was not going to let the humiliation end there. By the next morning, the media storm had begun. My phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, headlines screaming from gossip columns and local outlets. Ungrateful daughter shames. Family at sister's wedding. Businesswoman puts fortune above family. The words leapt off the screen, each one dripping with malice. My mother had wasted no time. She fed them carefully curated lies, painting me as the cold, greedy daughter who refused to help her sister start a new life. The narrative was simple, sharp, and designed to sting Emma Hayes, the selfish career woman who abandoned family for money. And the press ate it up. She played the perfect victim for the cameras. Tearful trembling, she told anyone who would listen that she had raised me with love only for me to turn my back on family values. She claimed I had humiliated Sophia, destroyed her wedding, and disrespected the sacrifices my parents had made. She even had the audacity to suggest that I cared more for boardrooms and bank accounts than for blood. I could almost hear her voice echoing from those interviews, dripping with venom disguised as heartbreak. For the tabloids, it was gold. Pictures of me leaving the ballroom circulated alongside my mother's pitiful pleas. Commentators speculated about family feuds, and some even questioned whether I was mentally fit to run a multi-million-dollar company. My inbox filled with strangers' accusations. "You're a disgrace. Money won't keep you warm at night. How could you do this to your family?" The cruelty stung not because I believed them, but because it was all too easy for the world to believe her version of events. And yet, I stayed silent. I had learned long ago that reacting in anger only fed the fire. Instead, I waited, knowing that David had been watching all of this unfold with cold precision. He wasn't a man who wasted energy on rumors. He dealt in facts, and when the time came, his facts would burn hotter than any lie my mother could spin. The shift came 2 days later. David's team released a series of documents to the press, signed loan agreements, showing my father had used my name, illegally forged papers bearing my mother's false signature, even correspondence where they discussed seizing my shares. It wasn't just family drama anymore. It was fraud, coercion, and assault. The same networks that had parroted my mother's story scrambled to correct themselves. Headlines flipped overnight. Emma Hayes target of family betrayal. Parents tried to steal daughter's $50 million fortune. Proof of forgery rocks. Hayes family. And then came the video. The slap. Captured from 3 angles, streamed live, replayed millions of times. The sound of my mother's hand cracking across my face became a symbol not of shame, but of defiance. Audiences weren't whispering about an ungrateful daughter anymore. They were outraged on my behalf. Talk shows debated the epidemic of toxic parents exploiting their children. Editorials praised me for standing firm under impossible pressure. Strangers who had condemned me days before were now sending messages of support. Through it all, I pictured my mother sitting in her living room watching her empire of lies collapse. She had overplayed her hand, and David had been waiting for that exact moment to strike. He didn't just clear my name, he made sure the world saw the truth, raw and undeniable. What she had meant as my public destruction had become her own. And as the story snowballed, spreading far beyond our circle of family and friends, I realized something vital. This was no longer just about me. It was about every woman who had been dismissed, undermined, or exploited by the people who should have protected her. My story had become a spark, and the fire was spreading fast. The story spread through the city like wildfire. The morning after the wedding scandal, my phone began to buzz nonstop with notifications. Articles from every major business outlet were splashed with headlines about the slap, the coercion, and David's thunderous declaration in that ballroom. But beneath the chaos of gossip and outrage, something far more lethal was happening. My father's empire was unraveling in real time. The first blow came in the form of a terse email from a client who had worked with my father for 2 decades. They cited recent concerns regarding conduct and governance as their reason for canceling a multi-million-dollar contract. Within hours, 2 more companies followed suit, each cutting ties with the Hayes family business. By the end of the day, 5 contracts worth tens of millions had been torn to shreds. The company's stock already wobbling began a freefall. Watching the tickers flash red, I remembered the smug certainty in my father's voice when he once told me our name is too respected to ever falter. Now that name was being dragged through the mud, every point drop in the market, another nail in the coffin of his pride. The phone calls started next. Business partners, men and women who used to toast with him in glass-walled boardrooms were suddenly unreachable. The ones who did answer spoke with cold finality. "Richard, we can't be associated with this," they said. "Your judgment is compromised. We're out." I pictured my father sitting at his oak desk, clutching the receiver with sweaty hands, trying to negotiate, trying to charm, but finding no sympathy. His charm had always been a mask, but now that mask was shattered and everyone could see what lay beneath desperation. He had spent years cultivating the image of a titan, yet in one night his closest allies turned their backs on him without hesitation. The empire he thought unshakable was crumbling like a sandcastle under a rising tide. But the final blow didn't come from competitors or clients. It came from within his own company. Late one evening, while I sat in my penthouse staring out at the city lights, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Attached was a scanned document and a short note. "You need to know what he tried to do." It was from a long-time employee of my father's company, someone who had worked under him for over 20 years. The document made my blood run cold. It was proof that my father had attempted to frame me using doctored financial statements to suggest I had siphoned funds from the company into my startup years earlier. He had planned to push the story to the media if his business came under scrutiny to make me the scapegoat for his failures. The employee wrote that they couldn't stay silent any longer, that loyalty had its limits, and watching me humiliated in that ballroom was the breaking point. My father hadn't just tried to exploit me. He had plotted to destroy me completely. I sat back, the weight of it pressing into my chest, but instead of breaking me, it hardened something inside. Every betrayal, every cruel word, every dismissal of my worth had led to this moment. The evidence was undeniable, and I knew it would spread like wildfire. When it did, there would be no salvaging his reputation. The once celebrated businessman would be exposed not just as a failure, but as a father willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his crumbling throne. I imagined him reading the headlines, watching his stock plummet further, knowing that this time there was no one left to blame. Not the markets, not his competitors, not me. Only himself. The next day, I heard from David that my father had been seen storming out of a boardroom after a disastrous meeting. He looked years older, shoulders hunched, eyes vacant. Employees avoided his gaze, whispering in hallways. The man who once barked orders like a general was reduced to a ghost haunting the company he built. He had lost contracts, partners, and now the loyalty of his own people. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. And yet, when I thought of him sitting in his office, drowning in the ruins of his empire, I felt no triumph, only clarity. He had chosen this path long ago, when he decided I was expendable, when he thought my life and my success were tools for him to manipulate. He had gambled everything, and now he had nothing. He collapsed, but I felt no pity. I had barely finished processing the collapse of my father's empire when the next wave of destruction began to circle closer, this time aimed at my mother. Watching him sink into ruin had been a brutal sight, but if there was one thing I knew about my mother, it was that she would never go quietly. Pride and appearances had been her lifeblood for as long as I could remember. She thrived on whispered compliments, on the envy of neighbors, on the illusion of perfection she wrapped around herself like a fur coat. And now, for the first time, that coat had been ripped away. What remained was raw, exposed desperation. The community that had once admired her turned its back almost overnight. People she had bragged to at church and country clubs refused to take her calls. Women who had once complimented her pearls now whispered that she had raised a scheming daughter who slapped her own child in public. Invitations stopped arriving. doors closed. She became a ghost wandering the edges of the society she once controlled. But humiliation alone was not enough for my mother. She could not accept silence, could not live with irrelevance. So she decided to fight the only way she knew, through accusation, lies, and the courts. When the lawsuit arrived at my office, I stared at the papers in disbelief. My mother, the woman who had carried me into this world, was suing me. The claim that I had stolen from the family, that my company was built on money that belonged to them. Her audacity left me momentarily speechless. I handed the file to my legal team, and within days the cracks appeared. The very documents she presented as proof, the forged signatures, the falsified transfers, became evidence against her. For years she had scribbled my name onto lines I had never seen, siphoning funds for her parties, Sophia's gowns, my father's reckless ventures. She must have thought she was clever, that her manipulations would vanish under the glow of family loyalty. But in the harsh light of a courtroom, her lies disintegrated. The press latched onto the spectacle. Headlines blared, "Socialite Mother Sue's daughter forgery exposed." Overnight, she transformed from the polished matriarch into a punchline. I saw her face plastered across screens, the perfect lipstick, smeared eyes red from sleepless nights, a woman unraveling before the public that once adored her. She tried to salvage what little reputation she had left. I heard she visited old friends, begging them to speak on her behalf. Most refused outright. A few allowed her to rant before gently asking her to leave, embarrassed to be seen with her. The more she clawed to maintain her status, the faster it slipped away. Every move she made only deepened her humiliation. For me, there was no triumph in watching this. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I didn't toast to her ruin. I simply watched, detached, as though I were seeing a storm batter a house I had already moved out of. She had built this fate brick by brick, lie by lie. I was merely a witness to the inevitable collapse. The last time I saw her in public, she was cornered by reporters outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward. She shouted, her voice shrill, wild with rage. She betrayed me. She ruined everything we built. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands trembling as she pointed directly at me, though I wasn't there. I saw it later, replayed 100 times online, her fury broadcast to millions. But beneath the venom, there was fear. For the first time, she was powerless. No whispered manipulation, no polished smile, no slap across my face could undo what had been revealed. She had lost the one thing she valued most, the ability to control the narrative. And in that unraveling moment, as she screamed at the cameras, stripped of dignity, drowning in her own lies, I felt an unexpected calm. The cycle was breaking. Her voice no longer had power over me. Her hands, once the tools of my humiliation, were now empty. She screamed, "You've destroyed everything." The days following my mother's very public collapse were strangely quiet, almost unsettlingly so. After the courtroom fiasco where her forged documents turned against her, after the community whispered about her downfall, and the news headlines branded her a manipulator, I expected an endless barrage of desperate phone calls and messages. Instead, there was silence. That silence, however, did not bring me peace at first. It felt more like the calm before a storm I had braced myself to face all my life. So I decided to take control in a way I never had before. I began by cutting every single channel of communication they could use to reach me. Their numbers were blocked on my phone, their emails filtered straight into trash, and their messages on social media accounts instantly silenced. It was almost liberating to scroll through my contact list and erase the last traces of them, like wiping away years of scars they had carved into me. For decades, I had lived tethered to the possibility of their intrusion, the sting of their criticism, the weight of their demands. With a few clicks, that cord was severed. But I knew my parents. Blocking calls and deleting messages would never be enough. They thrived on intrusion, on finding cracks in the walls I built. That's why I turned to something more permanent, my sanctuary itself. The penthouse I had purchased, the one they once mocked as too flashy for me, became the fortress I needed. I hired a security firm and had every lock replaced with biometric systems cameras placed at every vulnerable corner and a private guard stationed discreetly in the lobby. It wasn't paranoia. It was necessity. I wasn't just protecting myself from strangers. I was protecting myself from the very people who claimed to be family. When the work was done, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The skyline of San Francisco stretched out like a painting glowing gold beneath the setting sun. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I exhaled without tension, without that knot of dread sitting in my chest. The silence was different now. It was mine. No buzzing phone, no venomous voice on the other end, no sudden demand that twisted my stomach. Just the hum of the city far below, and the sound of my own steady breathing. That night I sat at the marble counter with a glass of wine, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and realized what freedom actually felt like. It wasn't the deals I had signed or the millions attached to my name. It was this moment no one could reach me. No one could diminish me. No one could lay a claim on what I had fought to build. My penthouse, once just a symbol of success, had transformed into a cocoon of safety, the walls carrying not only my achievements, but now my independence. Yet even in that peace, a shadow lingered. The scars my family left were too deep to vanish in a week of silence. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, shrill and commanding, telling me that walls meant nothing, that she would always find a way to push through. The rational part of me knew she was cornered, humiliated, defeated, but another part knew humiliation had only ever fueled her cruelty. People like her didn't stop. They plotted. The thought should have shaken me, but instead, it sharpened me. I felt stronger, more ready than I had ever been. If they came at me again, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would finish it. Sitting there in the quiet, I felt a strange, calm certainty that the story wasn't over. The silence wasn't their surrender. It was their regrouping. I swirled the last sip of wine in my glass, watching the crimson liquid catch the city lights, and whispered to myself, words I didn't dare say aloud for years. I will never be their victim again. But I knew they weren't finished yet. The announcement came on a Thursday evening, the kind of slot networks used when they wanted everyone to see it. I hadn't expected to watch, but curiosity tugged at me, and I found myself sitting in front of the television, glass of water in hand, when the broadcast began. There he was, my father, the man who had once stood tall in boardrooms, who commanded attention with a booming voice and a self-assured air that never seemed to waver. Now he sat stiffly in a leather chair, his eyes darting back and forth as though reading from a cue card. The words that tumbled out were flat, rehearsed, and drained of any sincerity. My daughter Emma has always been an integral part of our family, and a successful entrepreneur in her own right. He began, his tone wooden. Recent events have caused unnecessary pain and misunderstanding. I deeply regret the actions taken against her, and I offer my sincerest apology for the harm she has suffered. I could almost hear the lawyer's pen drafting those sentences. Every syllable felt polished and sterile, calculated to minimize liability and salvage the remnants of his reputation. But still there, it was the apology I had never once heard from him in my entire life. Even if it came from the tip of a lawyer's pen, it was still an acknowledgement. As the statement aired, the public's response was immediate. Online platforms lit up with comments, and news outlets began running headlines that carried my name alongside words like vindicated, resilient, and wronged daughter. For the first time in years, strangers were speaking about me not as a footnote in my family's story, but as someone whose dignity had been trampled and then restored. The tide had shifted, and it was not in my parents' favor. Yet as much as the words seemed to set the record straight, they did nothing to soften the memory of his betrayal. I knew this apology wasn't born from love or realization. It was forced, a strategic move meant to placate investors, the press, and perhaps his own dwindling circle of allies. The lawyers had likely handed him the statement hours earlier, telling him to read it word for word or risk further ruin. Watching him stumble over lines, mispronouncing a phrase here and there, I almost felt a pang of pity. Almost. But then I remembered the forged signatures, the debts piled in my name, the slap that had echoed through the wedding hall, and the pity vanished. After the broadcast, the calls began. Not from my parents, I had blocked every channel they could use to reach me, but from acquaintances, colleagues, even strangers. They told me they admired my strength, that I was an example of perseverance against cruelty. Some said they had experienced their own families turning against them, and seeing me stand my ground gave them courage. For a moment, I sat in my living room and let the weight of that sink in. My pain had become a mirror in which others saw their own struggles reflected. And my refusal to be broken had become somehow a kind of beacon. But not everyone was ready to bow to the truth. My mother predictably refused to participate in the apology. In fact, she doubled down. The day after my father's televised statement, she was caught on camera outside a luncheon, snapping at a reporter that I was a selfish ingrate who had twisted the family narrative for personal gain. Her voice was sharp, her words dripping with venom, and she clutched her handbag like a shield, as if the world owed her sympathy. The footage circulated online not as a defense but as a spectacle. People shook their heads and called her delusional tone-deaf, unable to grasp reality. Instead of salvaging her reputation, she had dragged it deeper into the mud. Watching her unravel, I felt no joy, only a kind of exhausted clarity. For years I had yearned for her approval, twisted myself into knots trying to please her. Now, as she stood before cameras spitting poison, I saw her clearly for the first time, not as a mother, not as someone whose love I should crave, but as a bitter woman, incapable of seeing anyone's worth beyond her own reflection. She would never apologize, because in her world, she was never wrong. Still, the contrast between my father's forced humility and my mother's raging defiance created an odd balance in the public eye. Where once I had been painted as the black sheep, now I was the one who appeared measured, dignified, and wronged. Their downfall was no longer just about their corruption. It was about their inability to face the truth. And people were watching closely. That night, I turned off the television and stood once more by the window of my penthouse. The city lights flickered like stars below me, and for the first time I allowed myself to breathe in the victory. Not the hollow, vengeful kind, but the steady triumph of survival. They had tried to erase me, diminish me, strip me of what I had built. And now the world was beginning to see them for who they truly were. But as I scrolled through the news, reading the comments and seeing the clips, my eyes caught on something else: Sophia. In the background of one of the recordings, while my father droned his apology and my mother spat her venom. There she was, her expression curiously calm. And then I saw it, the slight curve of her lips, the shadow of a smile that didn't match the chaos surrounding her. But Sophia, she wore a sly smile. I should have known the smile meant trouble. After my father's public apology and my mother's disastrous refusal to face reality, Sophia reached out. Her message came through an unfamiliar number, carefully worded, almost trembling with humility. Emma, I want to talk. Just us. Please. I stared at the text for a long time. It wasn't the kind of plea I'd expect from her. There was no arrogance, no superiority laced between the lines, just soft words that sounded almost like surrender. But the image of her sly smile from before haunted me, and my instincts screamed that this wasn't what it seemed. Still, I agreed to meet her. Not out of hope, but out of strategy. I wanted to look into her eyes and see exactly what game she thought she was playing. We met at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street in New York, far from the lavish halls she usually thrived in. She walked in dressed simply, her hair tied back, her makeup minimal. She looked younger, vulnerable, even as though she had been stripped of all the armor she'd worn her whole life. Emma. She began, her voice low. I've made mistakes. I let Mom and Dad push me into things. I was wrong to go along with it. I'm sorry. If I hadn't grown up with Sophia, I might have believed her. Her tone wavered just enough to sound authentic. Her eyes shimmered with what looked like unshed tears. But beneath the table, I noticed her hand twitching ever so slightly, fiddling with her phone, positioning it carefully against her purse. It took all my strength not to smirk. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to trap me, to lure me into saying something incriminating, something that could be twisted and broadcast as proof that I was the villain all along. I leaned back in my chair and let her play her part. She whispered about wanting to rebuild our relationship, about missing her sister, about how cruel the world had been to her since the wedding fell apart. Each sentence dripped with fake remorse, each pause calculated to draw me in. I nodded, feigning sympathy, carefully choosing my responses. I gave her nothing real. Just vague phrases, words that could be interpreted 100 different ways, but none that could pin me down. What Sophia didn't know was that I had anticipated this. David had warned me they won't stop. When you're at your strongest, they'll look for a crack to exploit. So before I came, I brought my own insurance. My phone sat in my bag, screen lit, recording every word. If she wanted a game of recordings, I would play it better. At one point, she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You know, Emma, if you admit you wanted the company all to yourself, maybe people will understand why you've been so cold to us. Just say it for the record. I won't judge. Her eyes gleamed as she tried to bait me. Her phone angled perfectly to capture my words. I smiled slowly, letting a pause hang in the air long enough to make her think I was considering it. Then I leaned forward. Funny you say that, Sophia. Because I know what you're doing. I see your phone right there. You're recording me, hoping I'll say something you can use. But here's the truth. I already have everything I need. And when this meeting ends, you'll wish you had never pressed that button. Her face drained of color. She fumbled for her phone, trying to shut it off, but I continued. I recorded this conversation too. And unlike you, I don't need to twist words. I just need to let the world hear how desperate you are, how you tried to frame me again. Do you really think anyone will believe your story now, after all that's come to light? For a moment she sat frozen, her lips parted, but no sound escaping. The facade of sorrow shattered, replaced by raw panic. She lunged across the table, her voice rising in a shrill pitch that made nearby patrons turn their heads. You set me up, she shrieked, her mask of calm completely gone. I stood gathering my bag and looked down at her with the same cold calm I had cultivated for years. No, Sophia, you set yourself up. I just let you do it. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor as she jumped to her feet, tears now streaming not of sorrow but of rage and fear. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, realizing her own weapon had turned into evidence against her. The cafe had gone silent except for her outburst, and I walked toward the door, every eye following us. Behind me, her voice cracked with fury, echoing through the cafe, raw and broken. Emma, you've ruined my life. After Sophia's outburst in the cafe, something inside me shifted. For years I had been living in constant reaction to my family, defending myself, proving my worth, standing my ground against their cruelty. But walking out of that cafe, hearing her scream that I had ruined her life, I realized I didn't have to carry their weight anymore. Their downfall was their own doing, and I no longer needed to let their poison live rent-free in my mind. Still, the scars they left behind were deep, and I knew surviving wasn't the same as healing. That was why I finally did something I should have done long ago. I called a therapist. The first session felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Sitting in a quiet office with a woman who looked at me not with judgment, but with patient curiosity, I stumbled over words I thought I had buried. I spoke about the slap at the wedding, about my father's betrayal with the forged loans, about the years of being told I wasn't enough, while my sister was showered with praise. For the first time, I let myself cry in front of someone who didn't want anything from me, who simply handed me tissues and told me my pain was valid. Week after week, the knots I had carried in my chest began to loosen. Therapy wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning to live without the constant ache, about realizing I was more than the damage they had done. Outside those sessions, I found myself reconnecting with people I had once kept at a distance. My colleagues who had watched me endure so much without ever knowing the full story reached out in quiet gestures of support. They invited me to dinners, to casual outings, to small gatherings where laughter replaced the endless tension I had grown accustomed to. Slowly, I let them in. I discovered new friends who didn't see me as the daughter of my parents or the sister of Sophia, but simply as Emma. With them, I could talk about books, movies, silly things that had nothing to do with betrayal or revenge. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to a circle of people who valued me not for what I could give, but for who I was. And then there was the penthouse. That place had once felt like a fortress, a wall between me and the world that wanted to hurt me. But in those quiet mornings when I stood barefoot at the window watching the sun break over the skyline, the penthouse became something else entirely. It wasn't just a symbol of independence anymore. It was a sanctuary for my spirit. The light spilled through the glass and painted the walls in soft gold, and I stood there breathing deeply, realizing that peace was possible. Each sunrise felt like a reminder that I had survived the storm, that every day ahead was mine, to shape untainted by their grip. One morning, as I watched the city awaken, coffee warm in my hands, I let myself smile without restraint. I had faced public humiliation, betrayal, and the collapse of everything I thought family was supposed to mean. Yet here I was, still standing stronger than before, surrounded by people who cared and guided by the strength I had fought so hard to reclaim. For the first time, I felt that maybe healing wasn't just possible, it was already happening. But even as I embraced the quiet rhythm of therapy, friendship, and the sunlit peace of my penthouse life had more in store for me than I could have imagined. I had no idea my career was about to rise even higher. The changes in my life didn't stop at healing. It seemed as though the very moment I began to let go of my family's poison, the universe opened doors I had once only dreamed of. Just a few months after Sophia's failed trap, and the steady peace I had begun to build through therapy, I was called into the executive boardroom. I thought it was for another routine strategy session. Instead, the CEO smiled and announced that I had been promoted to senior vice president. For a moment, I could barely process the words, senior VP. It wasn't just a new title, it was a recognition of every sleepless night, every battle fought, every time I had chosen to rise instead of break. The applause from my colleagues was genuine, warm, and I felt the weight of years of dismissal and invisibility fall away. But the recognition didn't stop within those office walls. Soon an email arrived that made my hands shake as I read it. Forbes wanted to interview me. Me, Emma, the girl who once ate instant noodles in a dingy apartment, who worked until her hands cramped on an old laptop, who had been mocked at her own sister's wedding. Now they wanted to feature my journey, to shine a spotlight on my work and my voice. Sitting across from the Forbes journalist weeks later, I spoke not just about numbers and strategies, but about resilience, about what it meant to carve a space for yourself when everyone, including your own family, told you that you didn't belong. The interview was powerful on its own, but what took it beyond anything I expected was David. During that conversation, he chose to reveal publicly what had always been a quiet truth, that I wasn't just another executive, I was a co-founder. He spoke of how I had built the foundation of the company with vision and grit, how my 25% stake wasn't a gift, but the result of years of dedication. She is not only a leader, he said, his voice steady. She is one of the very reasons this company exists. To hear those words spoken aloud, printed for the world to see, was like finally being seen after a lifetime of erasure. The article spread quickly, and the response was overwhelming. Women from across the country began reaching out, writing letters, sending emails, sharing their own stories of being overlooked, belittled, or silenced. They told me my journey gave them hope, that if I could rise from the ashes of betrayal and still claim my place, then maybe they could too. For the first time, I realized I had become something larger than myself. I wasn't just Emma, the survivor of a toxic family. I was Emma, a symbol of perseverance, a role model for women who needed proof that success could belong to them too. Walking through airports, I began to notice people glancing at me with recognition. At conferences, women approached me, some with tears in their eyes, thanking me for speaking out and standing tall. My story had escaped the confines of my family's twisted narrative and become something empowering. The humiliation they once tried to brand me with had been transformed into a badge of strength. I had been silenced for so long, and now my voice was echoing farther than I had ever imagined. Late one evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, I returned to my penthouse. I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window, the city glittering beneath me. I thought of my father's forced apology, my mother's venom, Sophia's traps. I thought of the little girl who had once been told she was too selfish, too unfeminine, too unworthy. That girl had grown into the woman who now stood here, recognized, respected, celebrated. The irony was almost poetic. My family had tried to strip me of everything: my dignity, my career, my peace. Yet it was precisely because I had endured their cruelty and chosen to rise that I now stood stronger than ever. As the lights of the city pulsed in the distance, I let the truth settle in my chest. Success was sweet, but what made it intoxicating was knowing that it bloomed in the very soil they had tried to bury me under. They had wanted me broken and visible. Instead, I had become undeniable. I realized living well was the sweetest revenge. After the whirlwind of recognition, after the awards and the Forbes article and the endless congratulations from colleagues, I found myself in a quiet moment staring out over the city lights from my penthouse window. Success had filled the spaces in my life that once were only wounds, yet there was still a hollow ache deep inside me. Accomplishment could silence the whispers of doubt, but it could not replace the warmth of belonging I had never known. That was when David extended an invitation that would change more than he realized. He asked me to join him for dinner with his wife and daughters, a family gathering. He described with such casual warmth that it stirred something unfamiliar in me. Anticipation mixed with unease. I had sat at countless tables, from boardrooms filled with sharp suits to charity galas sparkling with diamonds. Yet the thought of sitting at a family table as a guest of honor rather than a black sheep made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't explain. When I arrived at David's home, the smell of roasted herbs and freshly baked bread greeted me at the door. His wife, a graceful woman with kind eyes, hugged me as if she had known me for years. That simple gesture nearly unraveled me because I could not remember the last time a mother's embrace had felt safe. They ushered me into a dining room that glowed not with wealth, though it was evident, but with warmth. Photographs lining the walls, laughter spilling in from the kitchen, the unspoken comfort of people who chose to love each other without conditions. At the table, David's daughters sat across from me, their curiosity bright but without judgment. They asked about my work, not in the calculating way my parents once had, but with genuine admiration. One of them, barely out of college, told me she had followed my story in Forbes and saw me as proof that a woman could build something monumental without giving up her dignity. The words struck me harder than any accolade ever had. All my life I had fought for a place at the table, and here I was being looked at as an example not of what I owed others, but of what I had created by refusing to bow. I found myself laughing more easily than I expected, sharing stories about the sleepless nights of my early startup days, stories I had buried under years of tension. Every time I spoke, I saw their faces light up as if they were watching more than an entrepreneur. They were seeing a woman who had clawed her way to freedom and still stood tall. David watched quietly at times, his expression softening in a way that reminded me of a father proud of his child. It was not ownership, not control, but pride, the kind I had begged for from my own father and never received. Between courses, his wife leaned across and told me I was always welcome in their home, words, so simple yet so foreign to my ears that they echoed long after they were spoken. I realized I was sitting in the very thing I had longed for in silence, a family where love was not measured by obedience or sacrifice, but by respect and care. After dessert, as we lingered over coffee, David's youngest daughter reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You make me believe I can do anything," she said. My throat tightened as I searched for a response, but the truth was, I had never thought of myself as a role model, only as a survivor. Yet in her eyes, I was more. In that moment, I saw my battles reframed not just as scars of endurance, but as lights guiding someone else's path. It was humbling and terrifying, but also healing in a way I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in years, I felt the walls around me soften, replaced by something I had resisted acknowledging: belonging. When I finally left their home that night, the city seemed different. The same skyline stretched before me, the same hum of traffic below, yet I carried with me a warmth that success alone had never given. Family, I realized, was not bound by blood or duty. It was forged in choice, in love, freely given in hands, extended without expectation of return. I walked back into my penthouse, the silence less oppressive than before, and for the first time I felt that perhaps my story was not only about revenge and survival, but about finding something far rarer. As I closed the door behind me, one truth settled over me with unshakable clarity. I understood that family is not always born of blood. I had spent so long surviving, defending, and fighting back that when the dust finally settled, I almost didn't know what to do with the silence. For the first time, no one was clawing at me, no one was calling me selfish, and no one was demanding that I give up what I had worked for. The calm was foreign, almost frightening. But it was in that stillness that I realized I had been given something rare: the freedom to decide who I wanted to be when I wasn't defined by my family's cruelty. That freedom begged a question: what would I do with it? I knew the answer couldn't be keeping it all for myself. The empire I had built, the wealth I had fought for, none of it would ever mean anything if I didn't turn it into a force larger than me. So I began with the women who reminded me of myself at 18, struggling on cheap laptops, scraping together money for rent, and carrying dreams no one else believed in. I created a foundation specifically for women entrepreneurs who had the ideas but lacked the network or capital. I poured in the first millions myself, and when I launched the program, I personally mentored the first group. Watching their eyes light up when they realized someone finally believed in them was like seeing my own reflection years ago, back when no one gave me a chance until David stepped in. This time, I was the one stepping in. But I didn't stop at business. The memories of my mother's hand across my face, the cruel words, and the suffocating control had left scars deeper than I had admitted. I knew there were countless women who lived through worse every single day, not just words or manipulation, but bruises and terror inside their own homes. I couldn't ignore that. I began quietly funding shelters across the country, ensuring they had resources not just for temporary safety, but for legal aid, job placement, and therapy. I wanted those women to walk out of those shelters with the same conviction I had walked out of that wedding hall, with their heads high, unbroken. The media eventually caught on, and once again my name was in the headlines. But this time it wasn't connected to scandal or betrayal. It was about transformation. Interviews highlighted the foundation, the shelters, the speaking events where I shared my story not as a victim, but as proof that survival could turn into triumph. Invitations poured in from universities, from business forums, from organizations dedicated to women's rights. I found myself on stages staring into the eyes of women my mother's age, my sister's age, my younger self's age, telling them, "You are not invisible, you are not powerless, and no one has the right to take from you what you have earned." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family who had once silenced me was now forced to watch as my voice reached farther than they could have ever imagined. Every headline, every feature, every applauding crowd was another reminder that their cruelty had not destroyed me, it had forged me. I was no longer the girl sitting quietly at the family table while Sophia was celebrated. I was no longer the daughter whose scholarship money had been stolen for a dress. I was the woman who had built an empire and turned it into a lifeline for others. In those moments, with strangers thanking me, with women crying and hugging me after speeches, I felt a kind of family I had never known before, not bound by blood but by resilience. It gave me more than satisfaction, it gave me peace. For a while I thought the past was finally behind me. I convinced myself that their voices, their shadows had no hold on me anymore. but life has a way of testing that peace the moment you start to believe in it too much. One evening, after a long day at the foundation office, I returned to my penthouse, poured a glass of wine, and let myself sink into the comfort of knowing I had done good. My phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another work email, but something in me made me check. And there on the screen was a name I had sworn I would never see again. Sophia. The message was short, almost pitiful, but its impact was immediate. And just like that, the calm shattered. Then one message from Sophia pulled me right back into reality. Her message came late at night when the city was quiet and I was sitting by the wide window of my penthouse watching the lights of San Francisco glitter like scattered jewels. My phone buzzed, and when I glanced down, I froze. It was Sophia. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, not since her wedding had collapsed in flames. The preview of her text glowed against the dark screen. "Please, Emma, you're all I have left." My stomach twisted, not out of pity, but out of wariness. I had learned too many times that words from my family often carried hidden hooks. When I opened the message, I found paragraph after paragraph of pleading. She told me she was broke, that Brian had filed for divorce, and that his family had cut her off completely. She said she couldn't face the humiliation of returning to our parents, not after all that had happened. She called me her last hope, begging me to help her find her footing. "You're strong, Emma," she wrote. "I've always envied that about you. Please, don't leave me behind." For a moment, her tone almost reached the sister in me, who had once wanted to protect her. But then I remembered the smirk on her face as I was slapped in front of hundreds, the crocodile tears she used to manipulate the crowd, and the way she stood silent when Father announced the theft of my company shares. That memory hardened me again. She continued in another message, this one more desperate, more confessional. She admitted finally that our parents were toxic. She painted herself as another victim of their control, their favoritism, their lies. She said she had been brainwashed into thinking I was the enemy, that siding with them was the only way to survive. "I know they used me," she confessed. "I know they used you worse. I want out, Emma. I want to start fresh. I need you. Without you, I have no one." Reading those words, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. For so many years I had longed to hear my sister admit the truth. Yet now that it was here, it felt too late, too tainted. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her confession heavy in my hands. A part of me wondered if perhaps there was a sliver of sincerity in her. But I had learned the hard way that sincerity from my family often came with strings attached. And then the confirmation of my doubts arrived. A journalist from a small but notorious tabloid reached out to my assistant the very next morning. They wanted a comment on the family feud and claimed to already have Sophia's side of the story. My blood ran cold as I pieced it together. Sophia hadn't just come crawling to me. She had already gone to the press. She had tried to sell our story, my humiliation, my trauma, my empire, for her survival. The betrayal stung worse than her silence at the wedding. I dug deeper, and with the help of a contact in the media industry, I confirmed it. Sophia had signed a preliminary deal with a tabloid to share exclusive details of our family's downfall. She had painted herself as a tragic bride abandoned by a cold-hearted sister who valued money over blood. She had even fabricated details to make herself look innocent. But when the tabloids realized the documents proving my parents' fraud were already circulating and David had gone on record supporting me, they hesitated to publish. That's when she turned back to me, hoping to salvage something. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't sisterhood. It was survival. I stared at her messages again, the digital ink of her pleas trembling with desperation. She wanted forgiveness, a hand to pull her from the hole she had helped dig. But the knowledge of her betrayal sharpened every word into poison. She hadn't come to me because she loved me. She came because every other door had slammed shut, and I for once held the power to decide whether she rose or fell. For years I had been the afterthought, the shadow behind her spotlight. Now she was begging me to save her while my silence would crush her entirely. I typed out a reply, paused, then deleted it. What could I say that would matter? What words could bridge the decades of favoritism, cruelty, and betrayal? She had sold me to strangers for a headline. There was no repairing that. I closed the conversation and set my phone aside. Outside, dawn was breaking the sun, spilling its first light over the bay. For the first time, I felt not just strength, but clarity. Forgiveness was not my obligation. Her downfall was of her own making, and my silence would be the loudest answer of all. As I sipped my coffee and let the warmth settle in me, the phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophia, this one angrier, more frantic. Why won't you answer me? You're ruining me, Emma. You're my sister. You can't just ignore me. But I could. And I did. Because finally the choice was mine. I had fought too hard to let her drag me back into the shadows. Pain still lingered in my chest, but it was mixed with something new. A sense of justice. A satisfaction that the cycle had been broken. For once, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. And that decision was silence. It broke my heart, but I knew I was right to stay silent. The days after Sophia's desperate messages felt strangely quiet, as if the storm had finally passed. Yet just as her pleas faded into silence, another shadow loomed this time from my father. News began to spread through the business community like wildfire. His company, once propped up by lies, favors, and a crumbling reputation, had finally collapsed. Creditors came first, pounding on his office doors with lawsuits and unpaid debts. Contracts evaporated one after another, partners fleeing the sinking ship before it pulled them under. The empire, he had boasted about the empire. He once said, proved he was superior to me, dissolved into ashes before the eyes of those who once admired him. The press, relentless and merciless, documented every detail. Headlines screamed of financial misconduct, mismanagement, and betrayal of investors. I watched it unfold, not with glee, but with a hollow detachment. For years he had tried to diminish me, belittle my worth, and take what I had built. Now his legacy was ruined, not by me, not directly, but by his own hand. I thought back to the countless dinners where he would raise his glass and boast of his foresight, his unshakable empire. How fragile that empire truly was. Worse than the collapse of his company was the collapse of his circle. The so-called friends who once hung on his every word vanished overnight. The men who had played golf with him, who had toasted to his business genius, no longer returned his calls. At first, I imagine he must have believed they were busy, that they would come back when the dust settled. But the dust never settled. The invitations stopped, the phone calls went unanswered, and slowly the realization must have dawned on him he was no longer respected. He was no longer welcome. He was in their eyes poison. When the loneliness of abandonment set in, fate dealt him another blow. His health, which he had always prided himself on, began to fail. Years of stress, arrogance, and unchecked habits caught up with him. I heard whispers from a former employee, one of the few who still pitied him, that he was hospitalized more than once. Heart problems, they said. Exhaustion. Perhaps it was the stress of his collapse, or perhaps the weight of his own sins finally pressing down on him. Whatever the cause, his once imposing figure was now described as frail, diminished, almost unrecognizable. For me, hearing this brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was no joy in his suffering, no victory in his illness. But there was a grim sense of justice. This was the man who had stolen my scholarship money, who had laughed as my mother humiliated me, who had tried to strip me of the company I had built from nothing. And now, stripped of his power, his wealth, and even his health, he stood bare before the truth of what he was. No empire, no friends, no dignity left to shield him. Despite everything, he tried to cling to the remnants of control. I heard that he called meetings trying to convince old allies that he could rise again, rebuild. But no one believed him anymore. His words carried no weight. His promises were worthless. His name, a liability. Where once people gathered to hear him speak, now they crossed the street to avoid him. Even the family he had protected so viciously began to drift away. My mother, once the loudest supporter of his image, started focusing on salvaging her own reputation, leaving him behind in his ruin. Sophia, who once clung to him as her protector, avoided him, too consumed by her own disgrace. He was left alone, the patriarch of nothing, the king of ruins. And then, in that loneliness, he reached for me. A message arrived not through him directly, but through a lawyer. The words were clinical cold, but the meaning was clear. My father wanted to see me. One last time. I sat staring at the letter, my hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of choice. This was the man who had defined so much of my pain, who had caused the deepest wounds of my childhood and adulthood. And now, broken and dying, he wanted me to stand before him again. For years I had dreamed of the day he would regret everything he had done to me. Now that day had come, but not in the way I imagined. Instead of triumph, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. To see him again would be to open old scars, to face the ghost of the man who had shaped so much of my life through cruelty. I placed the letter down on my desk, the city's evening lights stretching beyond the window, and whispered to myself the words that seemed too surreal to believe. He wanted to see me one last time. When the letter from my father's lawyer arrived, I spent nights staring at it on my desk. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a summons into the past, a chance to look into the eyes of the man who had orchestrated so much of my pain. The decision to go wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him fade away into the shadows of his own ruin. But another part, the part that still carried the weight of unanswered questions, knew I needed to face him not for his sake, but for mine. So after days of silence, I agreed. The meeting was arranged in a quiet room at the hospital where he had been admitted. When I arrived, I barely recognized the man lying in the bed. The once powerful patriarch who had towered over me with his arrogance was reduced to a frail shell. His skin was pale, his voice weak, his movements sluggish. The tubes and monitors surrounding him made him look more human than I had ever seen him, fragile, vulnerable, breakable. For a moment, I stood frozen at the door, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. He looked up when he sensed me there, his eyes dull but still carrying a flicker of the man I remembered. Emma. He rasped my name, stumbling out like an apology in itself. For years he had used my name as a weapon, often said with scorn or disappointment. Hearing it now, soft and almost reverent, was disorienting. I stepped closer, my heels echoing faintly on the sterile floor, and stopped by his bedside. For a long moment, he just looked at me as though struggling to find the courage to speak. Finally, his voice cracked the silence. I failed you. His words hung in the air, heavy, almost unthinkable, coming from him. He coughed, struggling for breath before continuing. I built everything around Sophia. I wanted her to shine, to carry the family's pride. I thought, if I made you small, if I pushed you aside, she would rise. I thought there was only room for one star in this family. I didn't respond. My throat tightened, but I held his gaze, letting him speak. For the first time in my life, my father was not issuing commands or judgments. He was confessing. I stole from you, he said, voice trembling. Your scholarship, your opportunities. I let your mother treat you as less because I believed it was necessary. I thought sacrificing you would make Sophia great. But all it did was break us. It broke you. And now, it's broken me. The air in the room grew heavier with every word. I had dreamed of hearing this kind of confession, but standing there, it didn't bring the relief I once imagined. Instead, it stirred a strange mix of anger and sadness, like reopening an old wound that had never healed properly. I am sorry, he whispered, his eyes moist, his face etched with regret. I see now that you were the strongest of us all. You were the one who built something real, something lasting. And I destroyed everything I touched. I let the silence stretch, letting his words linger. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him his apology came far too late, that no words could undo the years of cruelty, the humiliation, the betrayal. Another part of me wanted to believe him, to cling to the faint possibility that somewhere deep down he had finally seen the truth. But I knew forgiveness wasn't mine to give. Not now. Not after everything. "I hear you," I finally said, my voice calm but firm. "But I can't give you what you're asking for." His eyes flickered, a trace of disappointment clouding them. "You want absolution, but I can't wash away decades of what you did. You chose to sacrifice me, and I survived without you. I built myself despite you. I don't need your apology to validate my life." He closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I just wanted you to know," he murmured. I stood there a moment longer, my heart aching but resolute. For so many years I had carried the burden of wanting his approval, of aching for his recognition. And now in this final encounter I realized I no longer needed it. His apology was his burden to carry, not mine to accept. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if I were shedding the weight of decades with every movement. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His voice followed me faintly, a broken whisper in the sterile air, but I didn't stop. My hand reached for the door handle, and when the door closed behind me, the sound echoed not as an ending, but as a beginning. As the door shut, I knew I was finally free. I left the hospital with the soft click of the door still echoing inside me, the sound of a chapter finally closing. My father's apology, late ragged and incomplete, didn't heal old wounds, but it loosened something I'd been carrying for years. As the numbness parted, another truth came into sharp focus. My mother had not apologized, not once. If my father's power had always been public, hers had been private, polished smiles, cutting whispers, closed doors that let the cold in. He was fading by inches. She was about to fall all at once. It began with the smallest social disappearances. A charity luncheon where her name was dropped from the host committee without explanation. A gala where the coveted front row table suddenly moved her to the back, her place card mysteriously missing. A country club brunch where women she once cultivated as allies turned their faces to their napkins when she approached. The phone calls she lived on, the ones that fed her. "Can you make an introduction? Can you seat me next to so-and-so? You'll be at the fundraiser, won't you?" They dried up. When she called, assistants answered. When she texted, no one replied. She tried to swan through it with that familiar hauteur head, high pearls bright. But social weather is read by instinct. People could smell frost. Then the doors began to shut with intent. The museum auxiliary asked for her resignation to avoid distractions. The hospital foundation, where she'd held a ceremonial vice chair role for years, quietly relieved her of duties, citing recent controversies. The church ladies who once fawned over her etiquette and arrangements stopped asking for her help at festivals and funerals. She arrived anyway, hovering at the edges with a clipboard she'd brought from home, and left with it clutched against her like a shield. I saw photos sometimes floating through feeds and group messages I no longer belonged to. Her smile stiff, her eyes lined deeper than makeup could cover, her hands hovering where there was nothing left to hold. Humiliation made her reckless. After the lawsuit she filed against me backfired, and the documents she paraded as proof became evidence of her own dishonesty, she doubled down in the only arena where no one could interrupt her online. Under anonymous comments, she wrote that I'd always been cold, that I had abandoned family for money, that I had corrupted the city's values. People screenshotted her mistakes, the phrasing, the rhythm, the telltale capitalizations, and passed them around like a cruel parlor game. "It's her," they said. "It has to be." Eventually, even the people who half agreed with her tone turned away from the spectacle. She wasn't persuasive anymore. She was loud. There's nothing society hates more than a woman who refuses to play by their rules while still begging for their applause. I avoided her in public, which in a city like ours requires strategy. I learned which openings she might haunt, which luncheons she might crash, which fundraisers she'd try to resuscitate her image at. Still, we crossed paths once. It was at a bookstore event where I'd been invited to speak about mentorship and building equitable companies. She stood near the back, uninvited, wrapped in a camel coat she'd worn for years. When the Q&A ended and women lined up to thank me, she didn't approach. She stared unblinking, burning through me with an expression I knew from childhood, not sadness, not regret, but grievance. As I stepped off the stage, our eyes met. For a split second, I saw the calculation: if she caused a scene, if she wept, if she reached for me, which way would the cameras swing? She turned and left. The door opened and closed quietly, like a breath held and released. I heard stories afterward. She tried to host small gatherings at home, the kind she used to preside over with floral centerpieces and carefully rationed compliments. Only 2 guests came to the first one. None came to the second. She called the florist and canceled the third voice, bright as if she had changed her mind on a whim. Her hairdresser mentioned to someone who mentioned to someone else that she'd begun bringing in old photographs to talk about what we used to be. She showed them a picture of Sophia on a staircase in a ball gown, and told them, chin high, this is what class looked like. The hairdresser stopped scheduling her on Saturdays. It was kinder that way. I did not rescue her. I did not join her. Once upon a time, that choice would have poisoned me with guilt. Now it tasted like clean water. Loving myself meant not volunteering to be her stage again. There were days the resolve felt easy. There were nights, I admit, when it didn't. I would watch the sky deepen from my window and wonder whether my refusal made me cruel. But then the old scenes would unspool: the slap in the ballroom, the forged signature, the microphone threats, the way she smiled for the world while dismantling me at our kitchen table, and the doubt would quiet. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are fences around the garden where your soul survives. The city finished what the scandal began. She stopped getting invited anywhere that mattered to her. She lost positions that made her feel vital. She traded the currency of favors for the coins of complaint. People in grocery store aisles turned their carts to avoid hers. Women who once whispered to her now whispered about her. She learned the true brutality of social exile, not the shouted condemnation, but the silence, the absence, the empty chair that stays empty because no one wants to be seen sitting beside you. She tried indignation. She tried tears. She tried pretending she didn't care. None of it worked. I don't know when loneliness settled in like a permanent winter. I only know that the last message she sent, forwarded through a relative who still believed blood required bridges, wasn't an apology. It was a defense. Your father wouldn't have done what he did if you hadn't been so difficult, she wrote. If you had been more grateful, none of this would have happened. The words weren't sharp. They were tired, thin as paper. But they carried the same old toxin. In her mind, the universe still orbited around her suffering, and I was still the one bending it out of alignment. By then, her world had shrunk: fewer calls, fewer rooms, fewer friends to hear the story she'd always told about herself. She became a late afternoon figure in windows, a held breath during charity broadcasts, a name spoken less and less until it was only an echo among people who remembered when. In that narrowing, the bitterness concentrated. She wore it like perfume, so heavy it followed her even after she left the room. I could have gone to see her. I could have rung the doorbell and let the old script run one more time. But that would have been for the woman she once pretended to be, not the woman she had chosen time and again to become. And I was done performing. The truth is, she stood at the edge of her own cliff and stepped forward. All I did was refuse to be the net she fell into. When I finally set the letter down, when I finally turned my face away from her shadow. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release, like a storm moving off the coast at last. People will say she got what she deserved. Maybe. I only know she got what she built. Even at the end, she still blamed me. When my mother finally disappeared from the rooms she used to command, the city exhaled. The echoes of her name faded from luncheons and donor lists, and with that quiet came another sound paper being shuffled in family court. I didn't go looking for any of it. The news found me anyway. A colleague forwarded an article with a clipped note, "You'll want to see this." It was a simple filing notice, dry as ash. Sophia had petitioned for divorce. 4 months after the wedding that was supposed to crown her life, the tiara had slipped off, hit the marble, and cracked clean through. I didn't gloat. The truth is, divorce papers don't parade. They sit heavy in file folders and leave fingerprints on lives that were already smudged. But even from a distance, the shape of it was clear. The counseling her in-laws had insisted on, the interviews with their attorneys, the family meetings where expectations were laid out like contracts, Sophia had stumbled through it all with that same reflex she'd always had. Look for the shortcut, the benefactor, the lever. When none appeared, she reached for old tools. Tears, charm, deflection. They worked for a week, then a day, then not at all. Brian's parents stopped taking her calls. The brunch invitations from their side evaporated. Old photos vanished from their social feeds. Even the friendly aunt who had once told Sophia she'd arrived sent a message through a third party. It would be better for everyone if she didn't come around for a while. In the tidy language of polite society, that wasn't a pause. It was a door closing with a latch you couldn't jiggle open. I heard from someone in their circle that the final conversation had been mercilessly kind. "This isn't a fit," Brian's father had said, voice even. "Not for our son, not for our family. We wish you well." Wishes, I thought, are the lightest currency. They cost nothing. They buy nothing. The day the papers were signed, I happened to be 3 blocks from the courthouse for a meeting. I didn't plan to see her. I didn't want to. But fate, cruel, curious, or both, set our paths on a collision course in the corridor outside the clerk's office. She stepped out with a manila envelope pressed to her chest, eyes swollen, makeup applied with trembling hands that had tried and failed to recreate innocence. For a heartbeat, she didn't see me. The corridor was all echo footsteps, hushed voices, the soft thud of doors. Then her gaze lifted and caught mine. It wasn't the look I remembered from the ballroom. The little smile, the entitlement polished to a shine. It wasn't even the calculating glint she wore at the cafe when she tried to record me into a confession. This was something smaller, emptied out as if her armor had rusted from the inside. She stopped, and for a long second we stared at each other across a rectangle of sunlight falling from a high window. "Emma," she said, and my name didn't curl this time. It just fell. She glanced down the hall as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then back at me. A brittle laugh escaped her, the kind that hurts your throat on the way up. "It's done." I didn't ask for details. The envelope told me everything I needed to know. "They said I made everything harder," she murmured, trying to sound amused and failing. "That I wanted the life without the work." "Can you imagine?" She swallowed and her voice thinned. "Brian said I was always performing. He said he never knew which version of me was real. There are 1,000 things a sister can say in a hallway like that. Comfort is one, condemnation is another. I chose neither. Truth delivered softly can be the cleanest cut. Did you?" I asked. Her mouth trembled. "I don't know anymore." Behind her, a door opened and 2 people I recognized from the wedding, old family friends of the groom, stepped out. They looked at me, then at her, and made a polite path around us as if we were breakable glass. The space they left was a circle of cold air. Sophia hugged the envelope tighter. "I tried," she whispered, as if she needed me to believe it even if she didn't. "I tried to be what they wanted. And then when that didn't work, I tried to be what Mom wanted. And then—" She stopped the sentence, collapsing. "No one wants me now." The words knocked at the door of pity. I didn't open it. Pity, I've learned, is a solvent that can erase boundaries if you pour too much of it. I kept my voice steady. "Wanting you and enabling you aren't the same thing." She stared at me, the recognition landing slowly like snow. For a moment I thought she might lash out. Old habits have strong roots. But the fight seemed to have drained from her. What surfaced instead was a fragile human thing I had seen only once or twice when we were very young, in the middle of the night, when monsters were just shapes on a wall and not people in your house. "I'm not good at this," she said. "At losing." "No one is," I answered. "It teaches what winning never will." She took a step closer, and I felt the old gravity of her, the pull of history trying to drag me back into the orbit I'd spent years escaping. "Do you ever feel empty?" she asked. All the rooms you walk into clap for you now. Don't you still come home and feel like it's all quiet? I could have told her about the mornings at my window, the sun lifting the city like a promise, the peace that doesn't shout but settles. I could have told her about dinners where laughter wasn't a performance and hands were kind without being costly. I didn't. Those truths weren't for trading in hallways like currency. They were for keeping. An officer passed. A clerk rolled a cart of files between us and nodded. The world, relentless in its schedule, kept moving. Sophia's shoulders sagged. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if the dress she'd worn at the wedding had always been a size too big and no one had noticed until now. For a long moment we simply stood. Then she leaned in just enough that I could hear her without anyone else catching a word, and she whispered it, the line I had once imagined she would never utter. "You won." The words could have tasted like sugar. They didn't. They tasted like an epitaph. Victory that demands someone else's ruin is a thin meal. I let the sentence hang between us until it lost its shine. "This wasn't a game," I said quietly. "It was my life." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Perhaps she had run out. Perhaps some reservoir in her had finally cracked and drained for good. She nodded almost to herself, then stepped back, gaze fixed on the floor, as if the tiles could tell her what to do next. The envelope in her arms made a soft crinkle loud in the hush. I could have touched her shoulder. I could have offered a small mercy, a gentle sentence to carry away. But mercy is not always kindness, and what she needed now wasn't a balm. It was a mirror. She had to see the woman standing in it, unadorned by excuses. She lifted her chin a fraction and searched my face one last time, as if there might be a code there to unlock a former world. I gave her what I had, a steady gaze, unarmed and unafraid. Then I turned away, no anger left. When I turned away from Sophia in that courthouse corridor, the air outside felt different. Not lighter exactly, just real. I walked into the afternoon sun with no speech rehearsed, no last look over my shoulder, and no need to justify my choice to anyone. I took the long way back to my building, past the florist trimming peonies and buckets, and the newsstand man who always saved the last good crossword. Everyday life was humming along, indifferent to our private wars. That indifference soothed me. For so long I had been braced for impact. Now, for once, no blow was coming. Peace didn't arrive like a parade. It seeped in at the edges of my days, settling into places that used to ache. The first evidence appeared in the mornings. I woke before my alarm, drawn to the window the way a tide is drawn to shore. The skyline waited quiet and sure, and the first strip of light unrolled over the water like a promise kept. I stood barefoot on cool hardwood hands wrapped around a warm mug and let the city climb out of the dark at its own unhurried pace. Sunrise from the penthouse wasn't spectacle to me anymore. It was conversation. The day would ask softly, "How will you use me?" And I would answer by breathing in unguarded, with no one standing behind me, ready to critique the way I answered. There were no more phone calls full of barbs disguised as advice. No backhanded remarks about my clothes, my choices, my worth. Silence, once a menacing presence, became a companion with good manners. I turned off the last of my old alerts and filled the quiet with things that fed me. I started journaling again, not to document pain, but to notice small mercies. The neighbor's dog asleep like an overturned loaf in the lobby, the way the doorman saved me a newspaper when a headline carried good news about the foundation, the rare and steady satisfaction of watering plants that did not ask for more than sunlight and patience. Work took on a different weight. It no longer felt like armor. It felt like purpose. I blocked my calendar for mentoring sessions, and held to it as fiercely as I held to investor meetings. I visited one of the shelters we supported and sat on the edge of a low bed while a woman told me how she'd slept through the night for the first time in months. I watched a cohort of our grant recipients pitch their ideas to a panel and saw in them the fierce, bright hunger that had once kept me up on too many nights with an aging laptop and a weak Wi-Fi signal. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. I just needed to show up over and over with both sleeves rolled. My world widened in ways that had nothing to do with status. Dinners at David's table became a ritual I cherished not because of the linen or the wine, but because we lingered. We lingered after dessert to trade stories and wash plates together, to listen to his youngest wonder out loud about where she might live after graduation, and watch his eldest light up when I told her I'd read her essay draft. There were no performance notes, no rankings, no hidden scorecards. Sometimes his wife would send me home with leftovers, an ordinary kindness that felt like a crown. I kept therapy on my calendar without apology. Healing, I learned, isn't a finish line. It's the condition of being fully alive. Some sessions we sifted through the past like archivists. Others we planned the future like gardeners. We set boundaries in language that honored my voice and my safety. We even left space for grief, not for what I had lost, but for what never existed to begin with. Naming that absence made room for something new to grow. On Sundays, I walked the city without a destination. I learned the names of the trees in the park and the odd history of a tiny museum I had passed 100 times without noticing. I donated my prom dress memory, the one sharpened by theft, to a program that outfits girls who might otherwise miss their night. The coordinator sent a photo weeks later of a young woman in a dress the same color as sunrise laughing with friends. I had thought peace would be quiet. I hadn't realized it could laugh too. I traveled a little not to run away from anything but to step toward places I'd longed to see. In Kyoto, I watched mornings spill over temple roofs and thought of how discipline can be gentle. In Santa Fe, I stood in front of a canvas so saturated with red it hummed, and I remembered color doesn't apologize for being bold. On a coastal trail, the wind leaned into me, and I leaned back, and the exchange felt honest. Every time I returned, the door of my penthouse clicked behind me with the same small, certain sound, "You're safe." Letters began to arrive, real letters with stamps and loops of handwriting tucked among the bills and catalogs. Women wrote to say they had left a toxic job or a cruel house that they had enrolled in a class, or filed their own papers that my story had given them the courage to write their own. I kept them in a box by the bookshelf, and on days when headlines were loud or meetings were sharp, I'd pull out one and let a stranger's resilience steady me. It was humbling to realize that the life I had fought to build in private was working in public quietly, where I could not have carried it alone. The absence of my parents' voices became something other than emptiness. It became space. Space to host friends for stew on a Tuesday and let them leave with a container for lunch the next day. Space to say yes to an invitation because I wanted to go, or no because I wanted to sleep. Space to choose a dress because it felt like mine. Space to look in the mirror and recognize the woman there without an old chorus telling me who I was not. I do still think of them sometimes. Memory isn't a switch. It's weather. On certain anniversaries, the air changes, and I feel the old storm move at the edges of the map. When it does, I close the windows and make tea. I stand at the glass and watch the city hold. And it does. It holds. One morning, long before the city woke, I watched a plane stitch a thin white line across a pale sky and felt a rush of gratitude I couldn't quite explain. Not gratitude for victory. Victory is too small a word, but for the simple fact of having a life that is mine. A life where mornings are not verdicts, but invitations. A life where no one's approval opens or closes my day. A life that keeps expanding not because I chase it, but because I welcome it. Peace, I've learned, isn't the absence of noise. It's the authority to turn the volume down. It's the right to choose what fills your rooms. It's the steady knowledge that you will meet yourself at dawn and be glad for the company. As sunlight climbed the buildings and touched my floor, I set my empty cup on the sill and smiled at nothing in particular. The city was awake. So was I. I knew this story wasn't just mine. Peace had become a habit by the time I realized it had also become a responsibility. Morning after morning, I watched the sun climb the glass towers and pour itself across my floor, and the quiet inside me felt earned. But the more I lived in that quiet, the more I heard another sound, soft at first, and then insistent the voices of women who had stopped me after talks, who had pressed my hand in airport lines, who had written me notes that began, "I don't know why I'm telling you this, but..." Their stories were different in detail and identical in ache. A mother who used shame as a leash, a father who measured daughters by how well they disappeared, a sister who turned love into leverage. They didn't want my sympathy. They wanted a vocabulary for leaving. One evening when the light went gold and the city softened, I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter and began to write. Not a speech, not a statement. A letter really to whoever needed it. I wrote what I wish someone had told me before the slap that echoed through a chandeliered hall, before the forged signatures and public betrayals, before the years of being the family's reliable bruise. I wrote that blood is a biography, not a sentence. That we are not obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep people warm, even if those people share our last name. That peace is not achieved by shrinking ourselves to fit the shape of someone else's comfort. I wrote about boundaries not as punishments, but as promises you make to the self you finally recognize. I wrote about the difference between harmony and quiet, how one is played together with respect, and the other is imposed by fear. I kept it plain. No dramatic flourishes, no courtroom words. I described the day I realized that family first can become a weapon in the wrong hands. I described the way a room changes when you decide to stop performing. I described walking out the door, closing behind me with that small, certain click, and the way my life grew once the noise receded. And then I wrote the sentence that had taken me 32 years to believe: if your family hurts you, choose yourself. I published it on my company's blog because that was the only platform I owned completely, and I went to bed expecting little. By mid-morning the next day, my phone was vibrating across the counter like it had a pulse of its own. Colleagues shared it, then clients, then strangers. A podcaster in Chicago read it on air. A morning show in Dallas used it to open a conversation about elder daughters and invisible labor. A church group in Ohio passed it around after Bible study, with notes in the margins, "Me too, this for my niece." Book clubs posted it next to wine glasses and cheese plates. Shelters printed it and taped it to the office wall. Even a few men wrote to say it made them pick up the phone and apologize to the daughters they had taught to disappear. The notes that poured in were not dramatic confessions. They were small splinters of truth, bright enough to pierce. I thought I was the only one. I said no and slept through the night. I moved my spare key. I told my son we don't joke about Mom's body anymore. Each one felt like a lantern being lit somewhere I'd never been. The map of my life expanded, dotted with tiny flames I did not have to tend. I wasn't their savior. I was proof that survival can become a new architecture. Some messages stung because they were so familiar. A woman in her 70s wrote, "I wasted decades keeping peace that never was." Another said, "My mother died angry. I stayed anyway." Your story is the permission I needed to stop that story with me. Their words humbled me, not because they crowned me with anything, but because they made my own choices feel less solitary. I had not climbed out of the wreckage alone. I had followed light left by women who never got to publish their letters. The backlash came too predictable as a tide. A few voices accused me of tearing families apart, of glamorizing selfishness. I didn't answer them. People who have only ever known peace as obedience will always confuse boundaries with betrayal. The women who needed the letter didn't ask me to argue. They asked me to witness. I could do that without turning my life into a debate club for people committed to misunderstanding. In the weeks after the piece went viral, I was invited to speak to rooms I would never have entered before: the basement of a community center, where folding chairs held grandmothers and teenagers, a union hall where women in steel-toed boots ate from paper plates and nodded hard at the lines about dignity, a small-town library where 3 sisters sat in the back and held hands. I arrived with fewer slides and more questions. What would choosing yourself look like for you? I asked, and sometimes the answers were barely whispers. A locked door, a bank account. Not going to Thanksgiving. Those answers were not headlines. They were revolutions anyway. At home, the penthouse felt different with that letter in the world. Not bigger, truer. It was no longer just where I had retreated. It was where I had returned to myself and then opened the door outward. I kept the window plants watered. I kept showing up to therapy. I kept cooking stew on Tuesdays with friends around my table. I kept walking past the newsstand man and buying the paper when a story about one of our grant recipients made the front page. Peace didn't require hiding. It required honoring. The line between gentleness and strength is thinner than anyone told me. Most days I walk it barefoot. There are still days when the old ache knocks. Anniversaries, certain songs, the tilt of light, and late afternoon memories tricks. When it does, I do what I have promised myself I will do. I do not argue with the past, and I do not invite it in. I make tea. I stand at the window. I watch the city hold. And then I open my inbox and read a letter from someone I will never meet who said no for the first time and felt the floor steady. Their courage steadies mine right back. If you followed me from that chandeliered hall to this quiet morning, you already know the moral without me spelling it in neon. Blood is important, but it isn't everything. Dignity matters more than a photograph where everyone is smiling and no one can breathe. Boundaries are not barricades. They are garden walls built so something living can finally grow. Love without respect is a costume. Harmony without truth is a lullaby sung to keep you asleep. I didn't write my letter to burn bridges. I wrote it to build doors. Some of us will walk through them alone at first. Some of us will hold the handle for the next person. If you need a sign that it isn't betrayal to choose a life where you are safe and seen, let this be it. If you need permission to disappoint people who benefit from your smallness, take mine. If you need a script, borrow my sentence and put your name on it. If your family hurts you, choose yourself. The question left then is simple and hard at once. The mornings will keep coming. The rooms will keep asking for your presence. The mirror will keep offering you the person who has been waiting. Do you dare to choose yourself as I did? And that is where my story ends. But perhaps it is also where yours begins. You have walked with me through betrayal, humiliation, resilience, and the sweet quiet justice of living on my own terms. Now I want to turn to you. What would you have done if you were in my place that night, standing on that stage with all eyes fixed on you? Would you have walked out like I did or chosen a different path? I'd love to hear your thoughts, because every voice adds another layer to the conversation we started together. If this story moved you, made you angry, or gave you courage, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss the stories still to come. And please share your opinion in the comments. Your words might be the light someone else needs to finally choose themselves.